Chapter 370. Elemental God Equipment. The ultimate authority of the primordial God. There's such a thing in existence. Yes, this is the highest secret of the elemental gods. But now, all four elemental god equipment have been lost. Although the elemental gods know their locations due to their ability to sense god equipment, but from a certain standpoint, the four elements were all creatures from other planes. Modern magic, which used elemental magic as its foundation, was naturally a creation from another plane. That was why the anti-knight was able to directly expel the power of the elements and create a mana vacuum. This naturally meant that magic and magic items would be expelled. As for whether or not the power of law could expel them, although I would need to test it, I personally believed that it was possible based on this principle. After all, the power of law was currently dependent on the god of law. The god of law's divine power server was naturally a type of divine power. However, this wasn't a complete expulsion for no reason. It was just like how positive energy and negative energy fought against each other. Only a large amount of water could extinguish a fire, while a small amount of water would evaporate. In the end, it still depended on individual strength. This wasn't too ridiculous, but the other job class, Desecration Priest, was quite ridiculous. She could steal divine power. I didn't have any information on Desecration Priest yet. Apart from the fact that the karma connection between me and Victoria wasn't too close, the main reason was that this job class itself wasn't perfected yet. From a certain standpoint, Victoria had a typical dark elf mentality. She wouldn't walk down a path that wasn't perfected. Naturally, Desecration Priests weren't like Diana, who had already created the anti-knight class. Since she had many former priests under her command, there would be many subjects who wanted to experiment on her power. Naturally, there would be others who could help her. Judging from the abilities they had displayed on the battlefield, they were a mystical ability that could steal and draw upon the enemy's divine arts, magic, and racial talents. Yes, on the battlefield, they had even stolen the Sea Tribe's racial talent of controlling giant waves, which resulted in an incredible result. However, I had my own guesses as to how exactly this happened. Perhaps it had something to do with me, but the specifics still needed to be confirmed by the Sea Tribe. It would be too early to say for sure. But if I thought about it with my knees, if I could borrow the divine concepts and unique divine arts of every true god, not only would this ability be ridiculously powerful, it would also violate the authority and uniqueness of every true god's church. Perhaps this job class had already attracted the attention of the gods, which would cause a huge commotion. Right now, I needed to think about how to deal with ALS questions. This is really troublesome. I hope that Victoria can give me a suitable explanation. At the very least, in the eyes of outsiders, Victoria and Diana were my subordinates. Their actions were all under my orders. When Victoria couldn't bear the consequences, she would naturally find trouble with me. It was also because of this reason that Camderon directly came to look for me. The elemental artifact that he mentioned was very interesting. If the elemental throne gives the elemental gods an endless source of energy and regenerative abilities, then the elemental god equipment makes the elemental gods fundamentally different from ordinary elemental lords. There are many things that can't be explained clearly with words, but if you personally see it, you'll immediately understand. This sounded quite mysterious and harsh, but I could more or less guess why Camderon had come to look for me. At the very least, when I fought against Unravel alone, he didn't bring out any elemental god equipment. His power level was only that of a peak earth elemental lord. There wasn't any foundational difference. His scariest abilities of unlimited power and regenerative abilities were also gone after the elemental throne collapsed, and his melee combat abilities were countered, which was why I was able to win. It would seem that Onderoken wasn't at his peak form at that time. I felt that this was even more interesting after hearing this. After making some connections, I could even guess at Camderon's intentions and where the elemental god equipment was. The wind elemental god equipment is in a forbidden zone in the earth elemental plane, and the earth elemental god equipment is in a forbidden zone in the wind elemental plane. The elemental tide there is far too dense, and I can't go there. Since the elemental god equipment was so important, the existence that had sealed the elemental gods back in the day naturally wouldn't leave them alone. But in order to seal these god equipment, apart from the elemental plane, there would be no other choice. And the places where the elemental god equipment was stored would likely be places that even the original owner of the elemental god equipment couldn't go to. That way, even if the original owner of the elemental god equipment escaped, they wouldn't be able to immediately return to their peak form. According to Camderon's explanation, his god equipment was stored in the infinite hourglass, a place that only the earth elemental god could reach. Meanwhile, the water elemental god's god equipment was stored in a place that only the fire elemental god could reach. This was obviously a trap. Find help. This was already far beyond the scope of mortals. The Chaos faction, which had unsealed the elemental gods, only needed the elemental gods to cause the elemental tide to rise. Since the elemental god equipment was so powerful, why would the Chaos faction help the earth elemental gods retrieve the elemental gods' god equipment and turn them from fighters to bosses? Last time, before Omdarokin's battle with Camderon, he had tried to convince the earth elemental lords to do their job so diligently. It was likely that he had also gone to take a look at where the wind elemental god equipment was stored, but he helplessly discovered that he couldn't enter it no matter what. In the end, he didn't even tell us about this. Perhaps he had even made arrangements around the perimeter, afraid that outsiders would learn about the god equipment's existence here. Now, his motive was even more obvious. Seeing that Diana might be able to retrieve the god equipment for him, he had eagerly run over. Camderon was truly practical. At this time, of course, I wouldn't immediately agree to his request. I still needed to consider what I could extort from him. That god equipment of the elemental god equipment was quite tempting. At the very least, it would be enough for me to use when I needed to balance the frigid winter earth. While Camderon was still hesitating, and I was full of ambition as I thought about the future, we arrived at a city wall that stretched as far as the eye could see. We had finally arrived at the ancient city of Bardi. Our journey had also come to an end. Not long after we entered the city, we agreed on a time to meet with Orlos the day after tomorrow. Dragon Knight Archduke Orlos and I then split up. He wanted me to immediately meet with Orlos, but I refused with the excuse that I was too tired for traveling. Actually, I had been in a deep sleep for 7 days during my evolution, so my mental state was at its peak. How could I possibly be tired from traveling? I simply wanted to gather more information, or at the very least meet up with my subordinates and check the situation before going to have a chat with Orlos. As for the dragon's important matter, Helen had told me that the entrance to Dragon World was being guarded by an elderly senior, and that I would need to notify him before I could enter. After Helen told me where Cher and the others were temporarily staying, I wasn't in a hurry to meet up with Cher and the others. Instead, I sent Little Red and the others to meet up with me at the embassy while I walked around the streets and observed the situation. For some unknown reason, even when I was far away in the Forest of Dreams, I always had an ominous premonition when I decided to come here. It was as if I was about to meet with great misfortune, as if some calamity was waiting for me. I personally didn't believe in prophecies to begin with, but this omen I felt was different from those that didn't come with a reason. It was as if I had forgotten something, which caused me to feel uneasy. It was as if I had played around for an entire summer and had to copy all my summer homework to make up for it, but was still worried that something would go wrong when I went to school. By the way, back when I was still a student, it seemed that something would go wrong every time. Thinking about it like this made me even more worried. Plus, my system had recently been constantly trying to sell me things like resurrection anks and resurrection coins, which made me feel even more uneasy. What? Why wouldn't the system buy them out of kindness? Actually, resurrection coins would only be effective if they were used. That's right, I had to die first before using them. Resurrection anks would require me to learn the Tauren race's natural talent, ancestral summoning. Perhaps I would first have to change my bloodline to that of Tauren. At any rate, my system had never had any good intentions. She was probably just making fun of me. But this made me feel even more unconfident. Since my system's attitude was clearly that it wanted to watch a show, then there really would be a show to watch. From the moment I entered this city, My instincts were warning me to hurry up and escape. But some things are more problematic the more you try to avoid them. And with my current luck stat, it's likely that I won't be able to escape in the end. I might as well face them head on, don't you think? I turned around and saw that there wasn't a single person in sight. The streets were abnormally empty since it was nighttime. However, I could sense that I was being watched by at least 10 people. Shadow movement, disguise, escape through the earth, and there's even someone playing with camouflage. Are you trying to make me laugh? Or are you playing a ninja competition? You've done quite a good job at gathering information, but I don't know which faction you're from. What business do you have with me? 7, 9, 13, and then a bunch of numbers popped up behind me. Not only that, each person was saying one number without repeating the same number. What's the meaning of this? Is this some sort of password? And so I was quite confused. Could this be the head of an intelligence agency? But there shouldn't be something like this. They were even playing with numbers. Just how many digits was I supposed to say when there were more than 10 numbers? What's yours? And then, as expected, someone asked me for my number. Could it be that the intelligence agents are having a gathering and are reporting their own numbers? I get it. Since I already guessed what this was about, I naturally just went along with it. Perhaps I discovered some secret, which made me quite interested. I'm 97. Typically, intelligence agencies would have more powerful numbers the closer to the start of the exam. But since there were already 2 digits, I would naturally be ignored if I reported the lowest digit number. Perhaps I would be able to get by with it. Is it 97? I don't think so. Didn't they say 68 last time? Perhaps some old man was so happy that he recognized a few more. He recognized 30 of them at once? At such a time? What a joke. Are you all idiots? Can't you tell that this brat is toying with you? The moment I said this, there was finally someone who was a little smarter. He couldn't bear to watch any longer. And then, I sighed when I saw everyone's hostile gazes. It seemed that I still couldn't fool them. I prepared to draw my sword with my right hand. Actually, I'm not 97. I'm 9,527. All right. Now everyone knew that I'd fooled them, and they were all charging at me. Honestly, this is so strange. I feel like my luck stat has dropped even further since I entered this city. Chapter 371. Ayaya. I can't get motivated at all against such an opponent. By the time this mysterious battle was over, I had more or less figured out what was going on with my opponent. Looks like in the end, it seems that it is my fault. I accidentally walked into the forbidden zone of the capital at an untimely time. Not only that, I thought that I was infallible with numbers. And in the end, these nervous spies made their move. By the way, I only learned about this after asking these 10 or so secret agents. When I interrogated the first few, they either went crazy and tried to take me down with them, or they were killed by darts or arrows that came out of nowhere. This was just like a third-rate, outdated period drama. Now that I knew what was going on, of course I wouldn't stay in this area any longer. On my way back, I saw all sorts of black-clothed people on the roofs on both sides of the street. Although I felt that it was quite comical, I also felt like something was fishy. Is the crown of thorns here? The Mist Kingdom's inherited god equipment, the Roland Sacred Sword and the Crown of Thorns. The former had been given to Renee, while the Crown of Thorns had been lost to the world. Previously, when I was doing my system quest, my system had clearly told me that I had given the Crown of Thorns to a certain member of the Barty royal family. However, I had intentionally forgotten about it. Since there hadn't been any major changes in the royal family, nor had I heard about any god equipment appearing on the market, it was highly likely that the Crown of Thorns was still in the Mist Kingdom. Crown of Thorns, a god equipment ranked mystical item. Blessing of the Undying. The user of the crown will never die. Even if their body is shattered into pieces, they will be able to reconstruct themselves. Curse of the Undying. The user of the crown will lose all senses and become just like the Walking Dead. Destruction of the Undying. The moment the user takes off the crown, all the pain the user has ever felt will come upon them. Before the user is reduced to ashes, they will enjoy all the pain in the world. It seemed like a super powerful effect. Anyone who wore the Crown of Thorns would truly have an undying body. The user would even be able to transform into a berserker that didn't know fatigue or pain. However, according to the Mist Kingdom's ancestors, rather than calling the crown of thorns a powerful god equipment, it would be more accurate to call it an incredibly frightening cursed item. Indeed, the user wouldn't die, nor would they feel any pain. However, even if their shattered limbs had already turned into rotten flesh and bones, they would still barely be able to piece together a human form. However, a physical body that had lost its vitality would begin to rot and rot. No ordinary person would be able to bear seeing their own physical body turn into rotten bones. And that curse of the undying was even more true to its name. An unconscious berserker? Losing their senses also meant that they had lost their desires and pursuits. The food they ate had no taste, and the women they touched had no warmth. Over time, even if that person was not yet an undead, they were close to one. As for the last special effect, it was said that the person who took off the crown could howl in extreme pain for 3 months. The pain was not repeated, and then the person would shatter into pieces amidst the most miserable howls. What? This thing is a divine artifact? This was indeed a divine equipment. Divine equipment were just that powerful, yet useless. They either had ridiculously disgusting side effects, or they were basically unusable by any god. In a mortal world, the only god equipment that I had seen so far was the Roland's Sacred Sword. And this sword had been gradually upgraded through the concept of protection. Back in the day, it had no other strong points apart from being incredibly hard. For a god, a divine equipment was usually half of their soul. And when other gods obtained a divine equipment, they would be able to analyze its secrets. Even if a god had already perished, their divine equipment would still be worth searching for. And out of all the god equipment that still existed, the crown of thorns was the weirdest of weirdest. You could say that it wasn't strong. If a semi-god wore it, they would be able to trade injuries for injuries and easily kill 4 or 5 enemies of the same power level. But if you said that it was strong, no ordinary person would wear it. And in that despairing battle, the Mist Kingdom's strongest knight, Kaiserin, wore the crown of thorns. However, as he was only at the myth rank, he managed to cause tremendous damage to his enemies. But in the end, he was still sealed away, and the crown was taken off. Judging from how his soul didn't respond to my summons, perhaps he had already entered an eternal slumber. And as for why I wanted to retrieve the crown of thorns, it wasn't actually because I wanted to use it. This god equipment was mysterious to the core. But since it was left behind by my ancestors, my descendants still hoped to be able to retrieve it. And in order to search for my ancestors' relics, we had our own methods as well. Broken Thorn isn't reacting at all. Broken Thorn was a part of the crown of thorns that had been torn off. When Kelly learned that I was looking for the crown of thorns, she told me to carry it on me at all times. As long as I got close enough, the crown of thorns would react and guide me. But unfortunately, I had already circled around the crown of thorns once, yet there was no reaction. In that case, either the crown of thorns wasn't here to begin with, or someone had already worn it. It seems that no matter which one it is, it won't be a good result. I thought about this as I walked. Soon, I left the troublesome Royal Palace district and entered a brightly lit commercial district. This was probably the district that Howlent had mentioned Cher was in. The next instant, I became certain of this as I instantly ran into an alleyway. A pitch-black horse-drawn carriage was traveling down the street, with countless rotten eggs and fruits following closely behind it. Aunties and uncles who were shouting and throwing things were also running behind the carriage. The only reason the carriage was still intact was because a blue magical barrier was protecting it from the attacks. Meanwhile, the person who was currently casting a spell and giving a middle finger to the mage country's new ambassador to the Bardi Empire was none other than Cher. If I recall correctly, she's a lady, right? Yep. Actually, before I got to know you, I was a lady as well. The silly cat's comment was far too reasonable. I didn't know how to deny it, so I carefully shrunk my body to avoid being seen by Cher. It was obvious that Cher's pressure and accumulated grudges were quite significant for her to be able to force the formerly Iron Lady into a mad woman who didn't care about her image. It would be quite troublesome if I was caught. Right after that, I saw a familiar sight. A muscular man wearing an eagle mask ran past me with his naked body, chased by a group of guards chasing after him. It's the king of storms. He's just a pervert passing by. Actually, I felt that my international image could still be salvaged. But if everyone around me was like this, and it was even reported, then I was afraid that I wouldn't be able to save myself. And so, just as I was about to pretend that I didn't see anything, my system suddenly came to cause trouble. It's been a long time since I last saw you. Daily quest. Face your true naked heart. Quest requirement. Let's throw away our boring clothes and return to nature. This quest will be completed if you kill more than 100 people. You will be rewarded with 200 fate points. Every increase in the number of people you kill will double the reward. Quest punishment. Princess Peach's naked running show. System notification. This is a chance for you to farm fate points. Hurry up. If it's 200 points per 100 people, then it's 400 points per 1,000 people, 800 points per 10,000 people, 1,600 points per 100,000 people, 3,200 points per 1 million people, 6,400 points per 10 million people. It's said that the capital has a population of nearly 10 million people. I made some calculations in my mind and immediately came to a decision. Of course, this wasn't because I was tempted by fate points. It was simply because I wanted to take revenge for my cute daughter, Little Cher. Foolish commoners, you actually dare to harm my fate points. My daughter, have a taste of the Oni father's anger. Harloise, do you still have any original samples of Greed Spawn Body? I know you have some. If you don't, then make a copy for me right now. I need a lot. Cough. From a certain standpoint, Roland had once again created history, and all the citizens of Bardi had once again witnessed the insanity of this visitor. Chapter 372. You still haven't taken care of those sticky slimes that are everywhere. In the Bardi capital, Dragon Knight Archduke, Halent was famous for being strict and unyielding. However, he usually treated everyone coldly. Actually, he was quite famous in the Bardi Empire. This was especially so when the princes of the Bardi Empire were fighting against each other, causing his reputation to plummet. However, he voluntarily left the Bardi Empire to fight against the undead. This made him even more famous and famous among the younger generation. In fact, he even had many followers and suitors who voluntarily submitted to him. However, his current appearance probably couldn't even be considered dignified. His muscular six-pack caused the maids beside him to point at him. Yet, as usual, he intentionally had a serious expression on his face. However, everyone knew that he was only doing his best to maintain his dignity. After all, the short pants made from tree leaves were the only thing covering his body. Maintaining his dignity while wearing only half a pair of underwear was a joke in and of itself. However, everyone else couldn't be bothered to laugh at him. It was still good enough to have a pair of tree leaves. Everyone else had it even worse. His butler directly made 2 holes in the big porcelain vases and put them in. Some people directly put themselves in the wooden barrels and walked on the ground with only 2 feet. They looked like unlucky people who had lost all their money and were thrown out of the gambling city. Most people discovered that the best concealment item was actually hemp rope. As a result, all sorts of trendy clothing was discovered. For example, 2 ropes were tied around one's lower body and the other around 2 points on top. Some people even had ropes tied around their private parts. Looking at it from another angle, the human imagination was limitless. Some clothing was even worse than not wearing it all. Recently, many street artists have been searching everywhere for inspiration. All sorts of mosaic sculptures appeared on the streets. If it wasn't for the fact that the slimes had started eating paper, perhaps all sorts of wonderful paintings would have appeared, enriching the people's spiritual lives. Perhaps everyone already knew what had happened. There wasn't anything special about this incident. It was just that the slime's calamity suddenly swept through the entire city. Those sticky, soft-bodied creatures suddenly rushed out of the sewers, gutters, and alleyways to attack everyone. If these were ordinary monsters, the capital's defense wouldn't be weak. But what was surprising was that these soft-bodied slimes had astonishing resistance against physical and magical attacks. Ordinary people would be completely unable to resist them. Fortunately, these slimes didn't have any offensive capabilities. The most dangerous part of their bodies was their digestive fluids that corroded clothing and attached metal. First of all, they had incredibly strong life force. They were completely immune to any ordinary sword or saber attack, and anyone caught by them would be left naked. And for the strong, it wouldn't be difficult to kill them with a single sword strike. However, they would immediately self-destruct if they were too heavily injured. Their mucus would splatter in all directions with incredible speed and range. Just a tiny bit of it would be enough to destroy any ordinary clothing. But if it was metal armor, enchanted mage robes, or any other precious defensive equipment, it would transform into brownish-yellow sludge in the air, giving off a disgusting stench. All right then, we all knew what that would make people think of it. Actually, no matter if it was color or appearance, it was no different from that thing. A certain someone had no intentions of hiding his evil intentions. And the worst part was that the stench was incredibly difficult to wash off. Not only did the slimes directly touch armor and weapons, even Hallen himself had to wipe off an entire layer of his skin in order to wash off the stench. Even now, his skin was still bright red. Even the prideful dragons hated these creatures. For example, Halen's brother. Hallen had simply descended from the sky like he usually did and stomped a dozen slimes to death. However, the result was that Hallen was still lying in the public square outside his window, having his servants clean his body. The water he used was filled with a disgusting stench, and all the servants passing by would clamp it on their noses, making the slimes quite embarrassed. The most disgusting part about the slimes was their excellent reproductive abilities. It was quite common to see slimes splitting into two after eating too much. Originally, the dragon's dragon flames and large-scale magic spells would still be effective against the slimes. But in this city filled with ordinary citizens, it was likely that the moment they killed the slimes, they would also destroy the entire city. If it wasn't for the fact that Halent learned from a certain source that the slimes didn't have a long lifespan and would die of natural causes within a week, the entire capital city would have fallen into a state of panic. As Halent read the information letter written on the table using shells, he sighed about how a certain individual was able to use his personal abilities to cause the downfall of civilization. He also sighed about how his trade with the southern minorities had allowed the slimes to have their shell coins again. This really is pure, undisguised revenge. Still, this really is that person's usual method. You want my people to suffer the humiliation of having trash and trash thrown at them? Fine, I'll let your entire city enjoy running around naked and smelly. Halent felt as if he could see that person's malicious smile in the shadows. Perhaps this is also a method to show off his power. From a certain standpoint, diplomacy was no more than a game of compromise and exchange of benefits. The result of a negotiation would usually be decided before the negotiation even began. What couldn't be obtained in battle would also be impossible to obtain at the negotiation table. Let's ignore the Bardi Empire, which had broken countless records of how shameless they were. From a certain standpoint, their diplomats were nothing more than pitiful messengers. But although the final result was already decided, the weaker side naturally wouldn't just sit around and wait for death. Over the past few days, Orlas's amusing story of how he toyed with the mage country's ambassador had already spread throughout the entire city. The nobles were even betting on when this pitiful girl would explode in a fit of rage. In fact, every day, there would be youngsters describing how the mage country's ambassador had been forced to flee like a rat by the furious citizens. Some nosy individuals even personally intervened. From a certain standpoint, as a young lady born in the Bardi Empire, not only did Cher have no good feelings for her homeland, but her reputation was also in the gutter. Yet, she couldn't come up with a method to deal with the mage country's ambassador. This made it even more obvious that she lacked the ability to be a diplomatic ambassador. If this continued, it was likely that even the Cloud Tower would need to change ambassadors. This doubtlessly allowed the nobles to stand on high ground and laugh at the large country on the other side of the ocean. This also helped reduce the pressure on the Bardi royalty, who was surrounded by enemies on all sides. But in Halen's eyes, this wasn't a good solution at all. While Howland made the pitiful female ambassador into a clown to amuse the public, he didn't think too much about what would happen to the big boss if he provoked the small boss. And the big boss never seemed to have a good reputation. At the very least, he was famous for holding grudges. And now, as expected, the mage country's revenge had arrived. While ordinary people didn't know whether to laugh or cry, a military expert like Howland was actually thinking about the consequences of using this calamity on the military. A forbidden spell to cleanse the land? Casting a forbidden spell on their own country? How dare they even think of something like that? Was this a groundless worry? If that person was able to make the slimes only spit out digestive fluids that would corrode clothing, wouldn't it be possible to make the slimes spit out fatal venom? If the slimes could make the sticky liquid stick to metal and swiftly transform it into a foul stench, wouldn't it be possible to make the liquid corrode metal and cause a fatal explosion? At the very least, according to the information obtained from the high-ranked alchemists, this special digestive fluid was far more difficult to concoct than poison and liquid explosives. Since the other party was absolutely capable of concocting an extremely difficult digestive fluid, it was only natural that they would be able to concoct an even easier lethal poison. Making the digestive fluid only work on clothing fibers and paper fibers while ignoring wood fibers had become the main focus of all the alchemists in the capital city. In fact, if the slimes were to be more vicious, they would only need to add meat to their menu. Perhaps there wouldn't be anyone alive in the Bardi capital right now. And so, Howland directly came up with a plan that included these two possibilities. If the slimes attacking us are venomous slimes, exploding slimes, or even man-eating slimes, how should our country deal with them? Howland couldn't come up with anything, so he tossed his proposal to the military's general staff and the Bardi Royal Mage Association. Both of them came to the same conclusion, but Howland was greatly disappointed. They didn't have any new methods to deal with the undead calamity. They would either eliminate the source of the undead calamity before it started, or they would directly abandon a large area and cleanse the land with a forbidden spell. Without a doubt, this mist person had used his own method to teach the people of Bardi a lesson. Everyone who knew about the Bardi Empire now had a deeper understanding of just what sort of trash the top 30 of the calamity rankings were. Due to this commotion, Emperor Orlos's visit to the palace was naturally delayed. Emperor Orlos was probably affected as he sealed himself in his room and refused to see anyone. By now, the other members of the Bardi royal family had finally stopped their senseless secret fights. After all, not everyone could fight while naked. Even the streets were completely empty. After all, nobody wanted to come out clean and go back in a foul stench. The result was that the city that had been bustling with activity just a few days ago had now become a dead city. Slimes roamed the streets, and when the Bardi royal family announced that slimes will automatically disappear within a week, nobody wanted to provoke these disgusting creatures. Of course, not everyone was affected. At the very least, the mage country's diplomatic group wasn't affected. In fact, there was quite an interesting conversation. Just were these slimes? How did you know beforehand that they wouldn't dare to come in if you sealed all the cracks with wood? Everyone looked around, but maintained a strange silence. In the end, it was Eagle Storm who spoke up. I really missed those happy days. Last time, our Wild Bull Sex members increased by more than 10 times. It's a pity that the slimes now have an additional stink attribute. Otherwise, we could have used this opportunity to spread our teachings. How about we try contacting Milord Orlos and have him change the rules? I feel like you won't be able to find him, at least not until Lady Little Red calms down. From a certain standpoint, dragons were the same type of creatures as cats. For example, whenever a dragon was angry, it would pounce on something it didn't like, bite it, and sweep its tail around. And as long as a dragon was pounced on, it would explode like a balloon. Little Red and Molly went to find a volcano to bathe in the hot spring on the very first day they arrived in the city. Even now, their skin was still quite red. It was unknown whether it was because they were too hot or because they were angry. But judging from how the black-haired girl was constantly muttering, "Damned Roland, that bastard," and would occasionally glance outside the window as if she was looking for a target to take revenge on, it was likely that she was still angry. But after learning about a certain person's astonishing past achievements, when the royal family's representative used obscure words to express, "We were wrong before, and now we can't take it anymore. Please ask Elder Roland to retract his divine ability." After Shirley let out a sigh of relief, she inwardly marveled at that irresponsible fellow's astonishing achievements in the field of creation, but at the same time, she also felt indescribably happy. "He's actually helping me. Helping us take revenge? Since the Bardi Empire has shown their sincerity, we'll be able to get back on track. With such a forceful return, our negotiations will go much smoother. Perhaps he's not as irresponsible as I thought." However, nobody responded to Cher's words. Even Lilith, who had always been quite tolerant of Roland, couldn't help but comment in her mind. "You're definitely overthinking things. He's just that unreliable. He's even more irresponsible than you think. He's definitely not as nice as you think." At this moment, in the Bardi Empire's Royal Mage Association, a white-robed mage suddenly sneezed for some reason. He then shook his head and continued working on his new potion with his head alchemist. The X-19 variant has already begun to weaken. However, the two variants are far more active than the original species. It would seem that the slimes have a new species. This time, the target of their corrosion is adamantine, melting it into powder. Yep, next up will be the 108th experiment. Hopefully, they'll be able to survive for 2 more days. I suggest that we extend the lifespan of the slimes. Last time, my slimes didn't even manage to find many targets before dying of natural causes. I didn't collect enough data at all. Perhaps Cher hadn't noticed yet, but Olivia, the head alchemist of the Envoy group, had silently vanished without a trace. And right now, Olivia was also wearing the Bardi Royal Alchemist robe. She was an important member of the 3-member research group. Roland's undead structure, Miracle Alchemist Olivia's potions, and omniscient Heloise's magical knowledge. From a certain standpoint, this was probably the worst and most evil combination in the world. Even Halent, who had been incredibly confident in himself, would never have guessed that their conclusion was that the previous underground slime calamity had only lasted for a short period of time. That time, Roland had tossed out his experimental subjects and then left them to their own devices. It wasn't that he didn't have the ability to continue experimenting. But this time, not only were there other experts helping out, Roland himself was completely engrossed in his experiments. How long this calamity would last would depend on how long it would take for him to get tired of it. Soon, people learned that the smelly slimes had a new type of mutated species. It was likely that more unfortunate individuals would appear. The so-called wooden defense line might vanish at any moment, just like Roland's moral integrity. Even Heloise, who had always tried to persuade Roland, had no intentions of stopping him. After all, every single mutated species was now a part of her, a new ability. As Roland's power level increased, Heloise's power level was gradually being unlocked. The city-type calamity called Greed was currently displaying to the world the power that she should possess. As for diplomacy and negotiations, would the 3 mad mages who had sunk into research still remember such things? They were only overjoyed at the fact that there were more than 1 million experimental subjects. They were overjoyed at the realization of a new idea and the birth of a new branch of research. Chapter 373. This unprecedented tragedy didn't end in just 1 week. It continued for an entire month. If it weren't for the fact that the dragons couldn't wait any longer and finally managed to find the person who had forgotten himself, this 1,000-year-old city would have been destroyed for such an absurd reason. But even so, Roland still taught the Bardi Kingdom's higher-ups and dragons a lesson. He taught them what it meant to be unrestrained, to do whatever they wanted, and to create a natural calamity. By the time the number of slimes reached 3 digits, there were already slime kings and dream slimes that even infant dragons and silver knights were unable to deal with. The former was an amalgamation of countless slimes, and its self-destruction was powerful enough to instantly wipe out all clothing within a 5-kilometer radius. Yep, it was still the creator of nudity. As for the latter, it had 17 other special effects such as binding, illusion, lust dream, and so on. Those who were affected by these special effects suffered greatly, and there were already situations where people had to be censored from view. The immemorial blue dragon Ha Late Finderon Cassoswinner. This was a short name that had already been shortened after many suffixes were omitted. In order to communicate with other species, Ha Late Finderon Cassoswinner was one of the leaders of Dragon City. Ha Late Finderon Cassoswinner was proficient in ancient incantations, and he was also an immemorial dragon of the powerful dragon species. He had the same combat strength and authority as the immemorial dragons. There were a total of 17 immemorial blue dragons like Ha Late Finderon Cassoswinner in Dragon World. Of course, based on the dragon's habits, the number of dragons who would listen to Roland's commands probably wouldn't exceed 2 digits. And this Ha Late Finderon Cassoswinner was the dragon elder who would be communicating with Roland. The dragon's invitation to the mage country was quite urgent. However, these ancient artifacts also knew that this would be giving the mage country an excuse to be greedy. They also knew that the mage country would have an obvious advantage over the mage country. They had originally intended to watch this slime calamity, which was obviously a joke. In their minds, they expected that since the two sides would meet in the end, how could the short-lived species compare to the long-lived species in terms of patience and shrewdness? But in the end, they discovered that the other side seemed to have forgotten that they were the ones who had invited the other side. Finally, unable to endure the loneliness and the changes in the situation, he took the initiative to come to them. From a bystander's perspective, neither side was reliable at all. The dragons and the Bardi royalty had invited the mages to help solve their problem, and had even tied a ticking time bomb to both sides, making it seem like if you don't help us, we'll all suffer together. Yet, the mages just happened to give this responsibility to the unreliable Roland. And Roland, who was supposed to play the role of a hero saving the world, but was actually cleaning up the dragon's mess, lived up to the expectations of the mages and tossed aside his job. Every second counts now, but he actually wasted a month just like that. Does he still intend to do serious business? How can we let such a person come and talk to us? I told you that such a technique would be useless against him. Even if the Titan giants were revived, they wouldn't be able to cause much pressure to the mage country for a short period of time. However, Dragon World would be completely destroyed. They're indeed anxious, but we're even more anxious. But from a different standpoint, from the mage country's perspective, Hellent was the most suitable candidate. Any other archmage, considering the relationship between the dragons and mages, probably wouldn't be as carefree as Roland. Hellent hadn't come here alone. Hellent had also come to see Roland. Hellent had basically personally brought this calamity back to the Bardi Empire. Hellent had been under pressure from both the Bardi royalty and the dragons recently, so he hadn't been having a good time. Are those two supreme, immemorial red dragons still in the city? Yes. Then don't bother with them. Tell your Dragon Knight to pretend that they didn't see them. From a certain standpoint, not meeting them was also a way of expressing their stance. The red and black dragons had already appeared on the surface for quite some time, and the Donglan Principality even had a mercenary team of dragons. If Dragon City had wanted to interfere, it would have done so long ago. Sending the blue dragon elder, who was also a color dragon just like the black and red dragons, to meet with Roland was also a way of hinting and expressing goodwill. There's no need to even think about lifting the ban. Although our generation doesn't have many memories of the Bardi Empire's internal wars anymore, there's still those ancient artifacts around. It's too much pressure to go against tradition. That's why we're going to pretend that we didn't see you when you came out. From a certain standpoint, the surface dragons had already expressed their stance when Little Red and Hellent met, but didn't say anything to each other. This was already something that the underground Dragon City was delighted about. This meant that the black and red dragons would be able to freely roam the surface without worrying about being hunted down by their own kind. As for whether or not they could ignore each other face to face, actually, Roland already had an idea before he even arrived in Bardi. How about we change the red dragons' names to fire dragons or crimson dragons? Yep, female fire dragons will be female fire dragons. Male fire dragons will be male fire dragons. And black dragons will be gray dragons or colorless dragons. Right, their inverted triangular skulls are rather similar to dog skulls, and they're all poisonous. How about we change their names to poison dog dragons? That'll be the end of it. From a certain standpoint, this was quite shameless. However, as long as Little Red changed her name, there would indeed be less awkwardness between both sides. Little Red seriously considered the possibility of changing her name to Female Fire Dragon. However, in order to make the decision to change her species name, she would have to discuss it with the other older dragons of her species. There's no need to even think about poison dog dragons. Just mentioning this will cause the black dragons to go all out against you. As for that female fire dragon, although I can sense that she's filled with evil intentions, it's worth a try. In the end, Little Red decided to go back to the surface and discuss this. Perhaps in the future, there would be no more red and black dragons on the surface. Instead, there would be dog dragons, female fire dragons, and dragons that were about to evolve in a Monster Abuse 3.0. Without a doubt, since the underground dragons were allowed to return to the surface Dragon City had made a concession. For the dragons who were used to being proud and traditional, this was an incredibly large concession. In the end, this wasn't only because the dragons were of the same species. In fact, it was the opposite. The gold and silver dragons were even secretly talking about how to kill off these evil underground dragons. However, the Elders' Council's final decision was mostly due to the current situation. If one compared the real world to the game's history, the underground was probably the most different. The current underground was already united as one, and their combat potential and threat far surpassed the game's history. If they were all mobilized, it would be impossible for even one or two mega empires to deal with them. And not only was Little Red the Dragon Queen of the Underground Dragons, she was also the ruler of the Underground. She represented the entire Underground's power. Even if she didn't care about these worldly possessions, Dragon Queen Mises had already evolved into an immemorial red dragon at such a young age, according to dragon standards. She had proven her power through actual combat, and her reputation was also unprecedentedly good, according to red dragon standards. Her previous actions in fighting against Yonya and the Surface, as well as defeating the demons and devil schemes, as well as her anti-war plans as the Dragon Queen. She even came here to negotiate with the dragons out of goodwill. All of these already proved that she was one of the few red dragons who didn't have much ambition. Such a Dragon Queen would doubtlessly suit the tastes of the surface dragon cities. This was far too rare among the red dragons who had ambitions that surpassed their own power levels. As for whether or not the black and red dragons would attack mortals after they returned to the surface, that would be for sure if the superior dragons didn't restrict them. However, the dragons tacitly ignored this. In fact, not a single one of them brought it up as a point of discussion. The reason? Actually, not to mention the green dragons, blue dragons, and white dragons that would still attack mortals on the surface. Even the gold dragons and copper dragons that were good dragons in the legends didn't care about the mortals who would earn millions in a single night's sleep. Only the silver dragons, who were viewed as strange among the dragons, would fight for the mortals' benefits. They would even take the initiative to live in the mortal world. In the legends, the silver dragons would always appear as beautiful silver-haired elven girls. In the stories, they would even fall in love with a human musician. However, these rumors weren't groundless. The silver dragons were dragons artists to begin with, and they truly loved human art and creations. They also admired the human and elven creativity and artistic heritage. However, it was precisely because of this that the silver dragons often fought with their color dragons brethren. The silver dragons didn't have a good reputation among their brethren. Out of the 17 elders in Dragon World, there were only 2 silver dragons who were only weaker than the gold dragons. This was quite an obvious problem. Since the silver dragons and red dragons were similar in their choice of land and preferred to build their nests in volcanic regions, the silver dragons and red dragons had been mortal enemies since ancient times. The silver dragon's stance also meant that it was possible that their opposition would be viewed as a personal grudge. ALS Divine Faction, the Northland's Mist Alliance, and the Underground. On the surface, Little Red's visit was for the sake of the red dragons. However, on the surface, the dragon cities saw the 3 major factions behind her, Roland's presence here, along with the mage country support, caused the dragon cities to lose balance between tradition and reality. The Holy War was imminent, and Dragon World, which was the Dragon World backyard, was in trouble. They even needed the help of the mages. Just a tacit agreement would allow them to befriend so many factions. Not only that, 2 additional dragons might even be beneficial in future battles. Even if it would be a loss of face, it would still be worth it. And so, Roland's plan to take advantage of Dragon World's misfortune succeeded. Due to the pressure from many sides, the final result of the Elders' vote was 7-5, with 5 of them abstaining from voting. The surface dragons tacitly agreed to the return of the underground dragons. Dragon World was one of the 3 major dragons' residences. The Elders' decision was basically a public announcement for all dragons. As for whether or not there would be an additional female fire dragon in Dragon City in the future, as long as the black dragons and red dragons returned, that would be only natural. Of course, none of this would be said out loud. And so, Halent became the best messenger. He passed on Little Red's intentions to the dragons, as well as the dragon's decision. But on the surface, Little Red only came to visit once, and the dragons tacitly agreed. And when the dragon's decision was announced, the dragons had already taken a step back. Naturally, Roland couldn't delay any longer. At the very least, from Little Red's perspective, she didn't want to see him continue messing around. But the problem was that Little Red needed to find him first. Since Roland had tricked so many people this time, especially when he learned that he had accidentally tricked Little Red, who was in a bad mood, he unhesitatingly escaped. And in order to obtain sufficient experimental materials, he, Olivia, and Harloise directly defeated a certain unlucky palace alchemist, and then used him as a puppet to obtain resources while Roland hid behind scenes. If that was all, the dragons might have been able to find him. But in order to increase the speed and degree of the slime's mutation, Roland directly moved his laboratory into his own frigid winter Earth, leaving only an exit and a biological laboratory in the mortal plane. And so, the slimes, who had the power of creation, naturally became more and more ridiculous. Roland was already naturally immune to all sorts of prophecy magic, and he was constantly traveling between the 2 planes, making it impossible for the dragons to find him. In the end, they were only able to find Roland because Olivia, who had come out to put up experimental materials and record the situation, had been tailed. Although her creations were already ridiculous, she was limited by her age and magic power. How could an alchemist who had just reached the gold rank possibly escape the tracking of the older dragons? But when Halent and Hades arrived in front of Roland, they were still astonished. The great alchemist's laboratory had been completely emptied out. There were boxes filled with all sorts of slimes. Not only were there rows of pudding slimes sitting on the table waiting to be eaten, the dark red slimes were even larger than ordinary dragons, and they were currently devouring rocks in order to expand the laboratory space. When Dragon King Halent found the 3 fanatical researchers, they were currently researching the edible pudding slimes and the rock-eating slimes that could dig through the Earth's core. The former would likely become a new main dish in the Donglan Principality, while the latter would likely rewrite the Calamity rankings. From a certain standpoint, Halent had spent quite a long time trying to understand how the former and the latter were related, as well as why they were being researched together. But now wasn't the time to think so much. Halent hesitated for a moment when he thought about what the Dragon King had entrusted to him. Then, under Dragon King Halent's watchful gaze, he decided to speak first. "Lord Roland, do you still remember Lady Evelyn? She's asking you to meet her." "What? Who's that?" "She said that if you forget her, she'll really kill you." Chapter 374. While Roland was slacking off in the Bardi capital, the world didn't stop at all. In the west, the Ottoman Empire achieved an unprecedented victory in their 68th counterattack. Due to Diana's sudden appearance, the cleanup of the water was much faster than expected. Coupled with the fact that the Sea Tribe's funeral troops were willing to go all out, the Sea Tribe was able to hold on for quite a long time, even after the Sea Tribe's royalty led a large tribe to attack. When the humans finally retreated on the second day, the Ottoman Empire's engineers were able to empty out all the inventory in their underwater base. Perhaps the Ottoman Empire's proud aerial fleet would arrive much earlier than expected. Of course, the Sea Tribe could still declare them the victors since their opponents had been forced to retreat in the end. While the Aurora Knight, for elemental swordcasters, Desecration Priest, and Anti-Holy Knight all gained the attention of the world, the small, remote country in the north once again entered the sights of the major countries. Just as the Ottoman Emperor Dasos hoped that he would be able to keep these new powerful individuals here, he discovered that they had already headed north. It was said that their target was the Bardi capital. Meanwhile, in the south of Bardi, the war between the undead and the wood spirits had come to a standstill. The wood spirits were using this time to expand their territory in the Forest of Dreams. In just a little over a month, they had expanded to 12 cities the size of Oaktown. The undead seemed to be completely oblivious to this. After the new undead commander arrived, the wood spirits focused most of their attention on attacking Nitrain City. Unlike Davy, who was related to them, the new commander was rumored to be an Empire senator. It was just that he would never be able to become a semi-god due to his injuries from the previous battle. Under the supervision of the undead emperor, the new undead army was formed after two unlucky individuals who were slacking off were executed as a warning to the others. The second attack on Nitrain City was now in its prelude. However, since the entire Bardi Empire was constantly accumulating supplies, and even the backup army had caught up, the outside world didn't think that this attack would be any different from the first one. The wood spirits of the Forest of Dreams seemed to be satisfied with their victory. The three virtues had all returned to their mother's home. Only the contract heroes were still working hard to hunt and earn points. However, only the higher-ups of the wood spirits knew that the return of the three virtues and the contraction of the defense line were all in preparation for the birth of the fourth virtue. Meanwhile, in the eastern part of Bardi, the Holy War's Vanguard Squadron had fallen into a stalemate. They were unable to advance, as the furious dragons had already patrolled the skies twice. The warning was quite obvious. However, they were even more unable to retreat. Otherwise, the furious Holy Light Church would only need to label them as traitors who betrayed the Holy Light to make their lives worse than death. The Holy Church behind them was unable to force them to their deaths. The incident of the Holy Light Church stealing military achievements had already spread far and wide. Just cleaning up all the rumors and slander had taken up a great deal of effort. Even worse, this incident had shaken the trust of the Holy Church's insiders in the Holy Church. And it just so happened that at this time, someone brought up the incident of the Mist Kingdom. That abnormal crusade expedition, the Holy Church's internal conflict, and the fact that the Prince of Holy Light, who had died unjustly, was now Emperor Yongye's identity. Most people immediately treated this as a legend. However, it just so happened that the Holy Church personally experienced this incident, and all the details proved that this was true. When someone from the Holy Church asked Estrada, the living legend and strongest Holy Knight, this Holy Knight, who had aged significantly in recent years, responded with silence. Although this information was soon locked down, there were already many people who had doubts about the Holy Church. At the very least, many new Holy Knight and priests who had been hesitating to begin with left the so-called Holy Blessing system and chose to become Estrada's contract heroes. For a time, Estrada's new Holy Light teachings in the Northlands, which stated that one's identity and birth shouldn't be judged as a sin, and that one's actions should be judged as a sin, spread far and wide. According to this belief, it seemed that it was possible for a Holy Knight to coexist with the intelligent undead. And so, the Holy Church fell into a new round of internal conflict and purging. While the main battlefields of the Holy Church fell into a temporary lull, or a new war was brewing, the mega empire of San Antonio also met with trouble. But from a certain standpoint, San Antonio's troubles were self-inflicted. San Antonio was located in the center of the continent, so it wasn't invaded by external enemies. However, after Emperor Hant II suddenly died, San Antonio's only son suddenly left with his father. Meanwhile, Princess Maria and Prince Winston accused each other of conspiracies and assassinations, which led to a civil war. If it had been an ordinary civil war, it would have been fine. Princes with powerful troops would have been able to easily obtain victory and swiftly restore peace to the country. However, it just so happened that Princess Maria was rumored to be the strongest demon warlock in all of history. She directly opened the dimensional door to hell. But the only thing worth celebrating was that she didn't summon demons filled with destruction and slaughter. Instead, she summoned the relatively gentler Sulu demons and devils. At the very least, they could still be negotiated with and reasoned with. But when the Holy Church directly judged Princess Maria to be a heretic, the Holy Church was unable to do anything about it. In fact, since Princess Maria had made ample preparations, the Holy Church actually gained the upper hand in the Civil War. And according to rumors, Princess Maria was the death god ALS god envoy, which made the situation even more complicated. At the same time, all the powerful countries in the continent more or less met with some trouble. The entire continent welcomed the arrival of spring in the new year, and by now, everyone knew that the Holy War was unavoidable. While the entire continent was in chaos, in the Northlands, there was a region that had sunk into peace and tranquility. That's right, that region was the Northlands, where the 7 Northlands countries were located. The basic structure of the Mist Alliance had already been completed before a certain someone had left. San Antonio's civil war caused many core members to return to the Northlands to join the Northlands Alliance's faction. This actually loosened San Antonio's restrictions on the vassal countries, so some people had their own plans. At the very least, without the Northlands Alliance's constant obstruction, the 6 Northlands countries' integration sped up. The underground beastmen's migration had ended. New banners were being raised on the highlands. However, this time, the underground beastmen tribes didn't have any customs of being hostile to humans. Trade with the beastmen of the plains was also progressing rather smoothly. As long as the beastmen were properly controlled, the already isolated plains beastmen would have to actively integrate into the Northland society if they didn't want to die. The Northland's Elven Kingdom was still arguing over whether or not to completely integrate into the Mist Alliance. Meanwhile, the newly reborn Greyblood elves had already completed their migration and were beginning to integrate into Donglan society. Before the merchant caravans arrived, a large amount of handicrafts and specialties had already been prepared. These would probably be used to exchange for the Northland's food supplies that the Northlands lacked. Perhaps this wasn't necessary. After all, Amelia's new food supplies were being planted abnormally smoothly. The Northlands' military orders were booming as well. Timlad, who returned to the Northlands, followed a certain someone's instructions and began a new industrial development plan for the new year. Although 2 members of the royal family were unreliable and had left, with everyone's support, this time-tested country was still developing in a positive direction. After the war ended in the wilderness, and the other underground residents began constructing new settlements. This wasn't an easy task. Although there was a lot of land to choose from, there was almost nothing. Meanwhile, the underground residents' desire for land was almost limitless. Plus, there were so many different species living here that there were conflicts and troubles. The heavy work caused and the centaurs to complain endlessly. If it weren't for the fact that the older generation had been invited to take charge and the dragons patrolling the cities, they would have been in trouble. It was likely that there would have been major chaos. Even though Marguerite, who had a poor life, had been dragged into this work, and even though the Church of Law, including Shuedi, had put most of their efforts into this work, there were still countless unexpected incidents happening every day. The pitiful centaur and beastman king had been doing their best to escape every day, but he had never succeeded even once. In the Northlands, the Sluweir Kingdom and the Donglan Principality were now viewed as one family. After completing negotiations on tariffs and border crossings, in a way, they were now on the same side. However, the most vexing part of the Sluweir Kingdom's upper echelons were their queen's new guests. Forget about that Shota who always showed off his muscles. Forget about his strange personality where he would suddenly make strange bodybuilding poses His unique commanding skills were quite popular among the military. However, Omar's younger brother, who looked rather similar to Lord Roland, was even stranger. Omar would always shout about how explosions were art, and then cause numerous explosions. All right, this obviously suited a certain queen's taste, so the three of them started researching military tactics together. Yep, to be honest, I don't know what they actually researched, but the power and number of explosions kept increasing. As that brat named War became more and more capable of causing trouble, Queen Glena's explosive techniques seemed to be gradually improving as well. Every day, the people of Antoon prayed that the city would survive until tomorrow without being destroyed by explosions, prayed that they wouldn't be blown up into the clouds in their sleep. The Shilua Empire had also begun preparing for war. They had already completed the order for 4 out of 6 super battleships. Judging from the current progress, the North Star Fleet would be completely reorganized within half a year. As for reorganizing the entire North Star Fleet and its internal factions, according to the Empire's Prime Minister, Lionheart, it was, "Let me die again." That's impossible. You bastards, all of you are running far away and making me work myself to death. No, dang, I'm not talking about you. I'm happy that you want to help, but I'll be even happier if you don't do anything at all. By the way, please let go of that ambassador you're talking about. He's almost scared to death. But no matter how difficult it was, he would still have to do it. Lionheart was still quite busy in order to complete the mission that a certain boss had given him. Who else had he forgotten? That beast friend? After Roland left, he lost control of himself and celebrated in public in his own way. And so, while shocking the entire world, his crimes were finally discovered by this world's animal protection group, Droll Parliament, and he was now being hunted down by the entire world. Meanwhile, Eaglestorm, who was far away in Bardi, unhesitatingly said that he didn't know anything about this at all. Otherwise, it was likely that even he would remove his status as a droll. And at this time, Roland himself was in some small trouble. Or, it should be said that the trouble he created finally found him. Chapter 375. Right, long time no see. Or is this the first time we've met? Do you still remember me? I was quite angry when I heard that you lost your memories again. After all, we had such a good relationship back in the day. She had golden skin and beast-like eyes that seemed to be smiling. Her cheeks were flushed red, and she laughed out loud before even saying anything. Her neatly combed golden braids extended all the way to her waist. Although I had no memories of her at all, she didn't seem like someone dangerous who would threaten to kill me. Yep, if you don't remember, I can reintroduce myself. I'm Evelyn Savon. You can call me Little Seven. She had a strange name and strange numbers. However, I became even more vigilant against this seemingly friendly existence. This wasn't only because she had threatened me in the past, but also because she was obviously a dragon in human form. She had faint draconic might and golden draconic eyes. Any ordinary person would think that she was a dignified gold dragon, but judging from her friendly smile, she was likely one of the most dangerous types of dragons, copper dragons. This was a type of metal dragon that was considered to be a good dragon. Their main habitat was in desert areas. They were adept at digging holes and often lived in their own underground nests. They also didn't like to attack people. However, if tourists and traveling merchants were to list the most troublesome dragons, the metal dragon brass dragon would easily crush most of the evil dragons, the color dragons. They would at least be ranked in the top 3. Indeed, copper dragons didn't like to fight or attack others. However, they were especially talkative. They were skilled at telling jokes, telling stories, and so on. These personal hobbies all needed an audience. Fine then, let's just say that copper dragons were basically talkative, and it just so happened that their desert villas were usually completely empty. So, if they got too lonely, someone would naturally be unlucky. Of course, as metal dragons, copper dragons didn't like to attack or fight. They preferred to create a sandstorm so that travelers would unknowingly enter the copper dragon's lair. Travelers would often accidentally see priceless treasures scattered all over the ground. When the copper dragons attacked, the original owner of the copper dragon coincidentally returned and caught them red-handed. Then the dragon will threaten to eat you, unless you have a reason to tell him stories for 72 hours, or to hear him tell bad jokes for 72 hours, with no rest or repetition. If you didn't do a good job, the copper dragon would even bare its fangs and threaten you. It wouldn't let you go unless it forced you clean. However, you couldn't beat it, couldn't escape, and even felt that you were in the wrong. The 72 hours were often over, and the only time it could be released was when the copper dragon felt that if it continued, it would drive you crazy. In the end, a lot of newbies who had just started out would change careers and go back home to farm after being tormented once. Yep, I did encounter one in the past, but wasn't the result just more nagging than anyone else? That guy and I talked about Buddhist scriptures, and I think, therefore I exist for 2 months. In the end, that guy seemed to have become an ascetic monk and left all his treasures to me. Cough. The copper dragon was quite annoying even amongst the dragons. The copper dragons and the blue dragons, who lived in the same desert region, were usually mortal enemies. Some people believe that this was due to a competition for territory, or that the metal dragons and color dragons had a long-standing grudge against each other. However, I personally felt that it was simply because the serious and stubborn blue dragons and the copper dragons, who loved to joke, chat, and prank each other. Right, I'm quite interested in that prank you played recently. Could you give me some of those slimes of yours? I feel like Dragon World is too boring. It's time for me to get some exercise. Exercise? Are you trying to play a prank on me? Stinky slimes aren't very effective against dragons, but I have some slimes that are capable of stealing precious metals. If you agree to give me half of them, I can lend them to you. That won't be necessary. Stealing the treasures of other dragons in Dragon World is taboo. If you're caught, you'll be exiled from Dragon World. I don't intend to become a wanted criminal by all dragons. Right? Do you have any slimes that are capable of dying and exploding? I intend to host a banquet. We walked down the underground tunnel, chatting as we walked. It seemed like we were having a great time chatting, but I was actually on full alert. That was because this invitation had been quite unnatural from the very start. I hope you'll survive. Halen's parting words almost caused me to turn around and leave right in front of this underground tunnel. However, Evelyn, who had come to greet me, was now standing right in front of me. I was indeed quite curious about the name Evelyn that I had heard the moment I entered Barty, so I followed her. Why did you want to see me? Huh, I'm not the one looking for you. It's Evelyn Tour. Yep, she's our second sister. Right? If third sister wakes up, you should hurry and escape. She really wants to kill you. It's really dark and difficult to walk here, isn't it? I really don't know why they chose to build their nest here, even though Dragon World environment is so good. It rained again yesterday, and the ground was so slippery that I accidentally tripped and fell. Oh, it's so boring. It's not like second sister allows us to go out, so we're always here. There's no one to talk to. Hey, aren't you curious just how many sisters we have? Why are we all called Evelyn? Let me tell you, we have 10 sisters, but I think that little 11 will be born in another 2 years. Why aren't you saying anything? Right? Do you know how to tell jokes? I also wanted to say something, but shouldn't you at least give me a chance to talk? Ever since we came down, the bronze dragon had never stopped chattering. Although it was indeed relaxing to chat with a beautiful woman, I was unable to keep up with her rapid talking speed. She didn't even wait for my reply. I finally understood why the bronze dragon, who couldn't even keep her mouth shut, was here to greet me. How could I possibly have the energy to investigate her? I just wanted her to shut up. I do. Let me tell you a story. Humans are born from their mothers, and demons are born from their mothers. In order to deal with a naggy person, you either had to ignore them or be even more naggy than them, making them speechless and bored. However, but we dragons are born from eggs. Isn't that the same? Are we supposed to be called the eggs' mothers? Speaking of mothers, let me tell you, our mothers are quite irresponsible. All right then, she instantly stole the topic of conversation. She then started talking about how the vegetable I had eaten for lunch yesterday had 2 wormholes on its 6th leaf, and how careless her sisters were. When she started talking about how she took care of her dragon scales, how the dragon next door actually stayed in its egg for an extra 3.5 hours, causing the bronze dragons to anxiously hold a meeting to research it, only to go off topic in the end. I really wanted to find something to seal her mouth with. How could all the bronze dragons not go off topic? Forget about being a chatterbox. At least talk about something useful. Forget about being a chatterbox. At least remember to punctuate. I feel like there are dozens of flies flying around my ears. But unfortunately, we already knew when you arrived. It's your fault for being so shameless as to open the message from back then. I know that I'm a natural beauty. I don't need your praise. This is my fifth sister. You're so lucky. She always sleeps in, but you actually met her when she's awake. Isn't she cute? I'm not trying to say that I'm cute, but I'm super cute to begin with. She spoke faster and faster, and I was unable to interrupt no matter what. It would seem that the bronze dragon from back then wasn't powerful enough. No wonder bronze dragons were considered the most dangerous dragon species. These adult bronze dragons didn't listen to humans at all. The blue-haired girl who passed by viciously glared at me, her eyes flashing with electricity. She seemed to be a blue dragon. How could these two species of dragons, who were mortal enemies, become sisters? But it seemed that I finally reached the end of the tunnel. I turned a corner, and everything suddenly became clear. A gigantic silver dragon head was staring at me. This was a mega-gigantic creature. Just the dragon's eye alone was taller than a person. What was even more ridiculous was that this was actually a three-headed dragon that I had never heard of before. Her two equally gigantic heads seemed to be in a deep sleep. There were several figures standing on top of the dragon's head. When I looked closely, I discovered that they all had identical faces and different hair colors. It was obvious that they were the sisters that Evelyn Savon mentioned. No, I've never heard of Cher mentioning a three-headed dragon before. Are you Cher's mother? However, the gigantic dragon's head started shaking, denying my guess. No, to be honest, Shirley is our real mother. Chapter 376. It was quite difficult to communicate with each other, especially when most people were looking at me with hostility and apathy. However, communication was still necessary. Otherwise, how could I possibly have any hope for the future if I was completely confused? It was a rather strange feeling. Even though I had no impression of the silver dragon at all, I mysteriously felt that she was familiar. Not only that, every single word she said seemed to be able to touch my heart. This strange sense of familiarity was even beginning to affect my rational judgment. We were once good friends, extremely good friends. The elegant silver dragon smiled at me, but there were some emotions and expressions that I couldn't understand. Her sapphire and black dragon heads were still snoring away. Judging from what my second and third sisters said, I was certain that each dragon head had its own thoughts. Perhaps this was why she had to maintain her dragon form and was unable to leave this cave. This was obviously abnormal. There were multi-headed creatures in the natural world. 9-headed dragons had even more heads, but if each dragon head had its own will, then which direction they chose would be a topic of discussion. Most multi-headed creatures only had a single consciousness, and the only known exception was the ogre, a 2-headed ogre. It was a funny joke that they were good at fighting with themselves. What's going on with Cher? After all, the silver dragon in my eyes was Cher's adoptive mother. She was the one who said that Cher was her child. But now, the silver dragon was saying that she was Cher's daughter. So what was going on? Are you my granddaughter? I've become a grandfather so quickly. I'll say this first. I won't pay you back the New Year's money and pocket money I've been saving for the past several hundred years. Uffed. All right then, the other Evelyns all laughed out loud. Even the silver dragon helplessly looked at me. Her original elegance was nowhere to be found. Your brain seems to be even more damaged than it was 200 years ago. But from a certain standpoint, you're right. Don't run away. Nobody's asking you for pocket money. Cough. I really didn't intend to run away. I have so many granddaughters here. I just wanted to go back and buy some candy. I already told you, you're not my granddaughter. Everyone's complaints were filled with a sense of helplessness, at least in their memories. Although Roland was sometimes reckless, most of the time, he was still very reliable. Why did it feel like all the parts in their heads were broken after meeting him? Could it be that they had really gone senile? But right now, Roland was in a mess as well. I had mysteriously gained 10 granddaughters, and it was no longer sufficient to describe how chaotic the social circle was was right now. I was only speaking nonsense to ease the confusion in my heart. Ahem, to explain this, what do you understand about desire between men and women? Yes, the lust of the original sin. It seemed that it was finally time to give an explanation. I hesitated for a moment before giving my answer. It's a most basic biological instinct that is on par with appetite. Under the influence of hormones, they search for excellent individuals to reproduce. Their goal is to produce high-quality offspring and allow the entire race to evolve. You deserve to be single for the rest of your life. Sorry, I have a girlfriend now. Is that so? She must be very pitiful. After all, she met a man who doesn't know how to love. All right then. Evelyn didn't seem to have any intentions of hiding anything. Soon, I was able to understand what was going on. Lust of the 7 original sins. Evelyn. No, it was lust of the 7 original sins, Cher. Yep, it was Cher. Evelyn and Cher were 2 completely different individuals. Their current complicated mother-daughter relationship was probably my doing as well. As for what exactly happened back in the day, it probably wasn't anything good. At the very least, Evelyn had no intention of explaining it all. What happened back in the day? No wonder you forgot. After all, it wasn't anything good for you. In that case, since you've already forgotten, why bother remembering? To be honest, I always hated it when others looked at me with pity. This would make me feel like an idiot. But for some reason, I didn't feel any disgust towards Evelyn's rudeness. Instead, I felt a sense of familiarity and warmth. Am I a perverted masochist who enjoys other people's looks of disdain? No, I think it's just pure Alzheimer's disease. This is a friendly relationship between a patient and a doctor. The silly cat's retorts came as expected, but according to our agreement, her retorting now meant that all of Evelyn's consciousness had returned and that the slime calamity had ended. However, I didn't know how to respond to Evelyn's words. Back in the day, some things happened between us. The final result was that we all died. All right then, since there were so many things to criticize, my little friend and I were both astonished. We didn't even know how to criticize Evelyn anymore. But after that, even more things to criticize made me give up on the idea of criticizing her. Cher back in the day, she should have been called Cher. She killed me back in the day, but you didn't want me to die. You wanted to break the barrier between life and death. So the more I listened, the more numb I felt. It would seem that I was perhaps even crazier back in the day than I was now. My good friend Evelyn had died because of me, and so, in order to break the barrier between life and death, I did some rather insane things back in the day. Why does this storyline sound so familiar? Lisa and Eliza, you really haven't improved at all. I won't deny it, but things were different from back in the day. Perhaps it was because I was emotionally hurt or something, but back in the day, I was even more intense and went even more overboard. Why did I say that I was emotionally hurt? It was because Evelyn had provided me with her personal notes, and one of the things she said was quite familiar. So-called love is nothing more than a combination of animal instincts and hormones. Lust's ultimate effect on all living creatures is for the sake of producing outstanding offspring. The ultimate goal is the evolution of an entire species. In that case, I extracted a part of my soul that was related to love. Would I be able to create a special structure that would allow female souls to automatically produce offspring? This is quite an interesting research topic. I've decided to name it after the original human sin, lust. System notification. This is a portion of the notes that can't be read clearly. Don't be too grateful to me. I'm lay phone. By the way, the first part of the notes can be used as the FFF party emblem. Interesting, my ass. All right then, my system didn't respond to my intense retorts. Evelyn's explanation was still ongoing. You combined all 3 of our souls together. Cher constantly wavered between life and death. And as long as the time was right, she would activate the mechanism you left behind and give birth to a new Evelyn. That's why I don't even know if I'm your good friend Evelyn from the past, or if I'm just a simple soul replica. With the help of the notes and Evelyn's explanation, I was able to roughly guess what happened back in the day. Back in the day, Evelyn, Cher, now Cher, and I were all good friends. Something happened later, and it was nothing more than a falling out or betrayal. The end result was that Evelyn was killed by Cher in order to protect me. Furious, I wanted to take revenge for Evelyn and revive her, so I used Cher as my experimental subject. Due to the limitations of my abilities back in the day, my experiment was only half successful. The mother Cher used herself as nourishment and successfully created Evelyn. The price for breaking the barrier between life and death was that Cher herself should have died. However, due to the limitations of my undead magic abilities back in the day, an error occurred in this unsuccessful experiment. Even Eliza and Lisa were two different people. The original Evelyn's soul had already returned to the Gue Ming River, so it was impossible to summon her soul from the very start. This method of summoning Evelyn's soul would only create a replica made up of soul fragments and memories. The mother Cher didn't die either. She was simply an infant who didn't even know what had happened. Then, after Roland himself died, this abnormal experiment fell into a vicious cycle. Every time Cher reached a certain stage of growth, a mechanism within her soul would be activated, and a new Evelyn would be born from her physical body and soul. And as lust instinctively pursued genetic evolution, the new Evelyn would evolve and become stronger in all aspects. As this entire mechanism and the future generations evolved, the original Evelyn would also obtain the genes of the new Evelyn and evolve together. The entire Evelyn species was evolving generation after generation. At the very beginning, I was only an ordinary person with some dragon bloodlines, and I had many personalities with a split soul. Later on, I became a mixed-blood dragon bloodline, semi-dragon, half-dragon, true dragon. Now, Evelyn has been born 8 times, and Cher has lived 8 times. As her mother, I've raised her 8 times. After so many years, I no longer have a trace of hatred towards her. I only hope that I can give her a happy life, and the only one who can cut off the cycle of this curse and give her a new life is probably you, the one who started it all. Apart from opening my mouth wide like a hippopotamus and burying my head like an ostrich, I didn't know what else to do. You should have already guessed that Cher was your first love back in the day. However, the current Cher has nothing to do with her anymore, so please don't take your anger out on her. And if you get rid of those abnormal curses, you'll probably become more normal. That's right, it was a curse. Snow had been cursed at the cost of severing her own emotions. She would be filled with regret and pain, using her own soul to make up for her mistakes. This was a perfect example of a curse of vengeance. From a certain standpoint, I was quite foolish back in the day, paying such a price just because my first love failed and I was betrayed. You won't believe in women anymore just because your first love failed? Where did such a pure and innocent youth come from? Was I so Chinibu back in the day? You were far more Chinibu and innocent than you imagined. Didn't you forget about Cher the first time you reincarnated because you were worried that remembering her would be painful? Ah, what a beautiful yet twisted first love. As expected, first love is only delicious when it's sour and sweet. Sour and sweet, my ass. This is clearly poison mixed with SH*T. You're using SH*T to describe your first love? You have such a heavy taste. All right then, my system was becoming more and more shameless. It seemed that it had been waiting to see this joke for a long time. Indeed, Evelyn herself wasn't my creation. She was an independent individual, and the current Cher of the 7 original sins was indeed my creation. Naturally, she was also my daughter. But the relationship between Cher and me was so messy that I didn't want to seriously think about it anymore. Suddenly, I recalled Little 7's previous words, "Little 11 will probably be born in 2 years." Could it be that Cher's new cycle of reincarnation was about to begin? Were the conditions for triggering a new cycle of reincarnation? Although I already had a premonition that this would be a huge scam, I still asked. Love. Once Cher falls in love with someone, her life will begin its countdown. I collapsed onto the ground speechlessly. Was it really necessary for me to be so stubborn back in the day? This was obviously going way overboard. A reincarnated first love will be reborn as a baby as long as she falls in love with someone else. Roland, you're so ridiculously pure, so pure that it's twisted. I was rendered speechless by the silly cat's comment. In the end, I could only say something as I turned around and left. I'll stop the cycle of reincarnation. Let me take a look at Lust Share's internal structure first. I'll find a solution. Don't leave so quickly. I still want to chat with you. Forget it. Remember to come earlier next time. Let's chat first. The copper dragon Evelyn was still calling out to me from behind, while the other Evelyns silently watched as that man ran away in an incredibly pathetic fashion. A long silence continued in the underground room until a voice broke the silence. Why did you only tell me half of it? Half of it is enough. Cher has suffered far too much. It's enough as long as you can solve her problem. If you really want to talk things out with him, how could you miss such a good opportunity? The sleeping sapphire dragon opened her eyes. She was the first Evelyn, as well as the main personality of the three-headed dragon. However, up until now, she had been in a deep sleep, or more accurately speaking, she was pretending to be asleep. I'm forcefully suppressing Third Sister. You know how much Third Sister loves Cher and how much she hates Roland? Which one of us doesn't hate him? Hate him for completely ignoring Evelyn's love for him, only to fall head over heels in love with Cher. Hate him for intentionally stepping into a trap of certain death and using his own death to create a curse just for the sake of what Evelyn said to Cher, all for the sake of activating that damned endless loop. This guy is really a super hateful bastard. Everyone else is frustrated to death, but he actually has a new girlfriend. Serves him right for not telling him. The one who spoke up was actually the icy blue dragon Evelyn. That sentence? That's right. If there was anything that Evelyn was hiding, it would probably be the last words that Evelyn had said before her death. If reincarnation really does happen, I hope that I can become your lover in my next life. Before that, please don't fall in love with someone else. Perhaps this was Evelyn's unwillingness before her death, her final grudge, her hopes for her next life. However, Roland had the ability to turn this unwillingness into reality. It was precisely because of her last words of "don't fall in love with someone else before you die" that caused Roland to split his soul and abandon all of his love cells. Unfortunately, 2 years ago, before his last reincarnation, although he had forgotten about Lust Cher, he still remembered Evelyn. But now that he had reincarnated, he had lost this important memory. This was also why the current Evelyns were so angry at Roland. We were born with all of Evelyn's feelings and memories. But if we're truly Evelyns, how could there be multiple Evelyns? Just what did Roland do back then? Every single Evelyn was an individual. Naturally, everyone would have different reactions to the same thing. Evelyns had different personalities. Some had motherly love for Cher. Some still had feelings for Roland. Some wanted to kill him. Some wanted to stop the cycle of reincarnation. Some were looking forward to the birth of a new younger sister. Some wanted to continue their previous relationship. And some didn't believe that they had anything to do with what happened back then. By now, this had become a huge mess. And Roland's troubles had only just begun. Chapter 377. To put it simply, because I hated Cher's betrayal, I modified Cher's soul back then. And now, as long as Cher falls in love with someone, her intense emotions will trigger a hidden mechanism in the depths of her soul. The mechanism in the depths of her soul will be activated, and a new cycle of reincarnation will begin. During this period of time, she'll probably have a split personality, just like the three-headed dragon. Then, her memories and the Evelyn's personality will form a secondary personality that will gradually replace Cher's original personality. Cher's entire physical body will accept the previous generation's genetic sequence and be further optimized. Finally, the personality's soul will be the software and the physical body's hardware, and a new Evelyn will be born. The remaining parts will be the original Cher's soul fragments and the infant's physical body. Everything will start all over again, accumulating new evolutions. As expected of me, this is simply a masterpiece of superlative craftsmanship, a deranged lunatic. The looks of disdain around me made me change my words in the end. But from the bottom of my heart, I was certain that I was definitely a genius back in the day. Otherwise, I wouldn't have been able to come up with such a destructive design. Evelyn was correct. Only the one who started the trouble would be able to solve it. It would be impossible to analyze such a complex design if one didn't understand how it was designed. And if one couldn't analyze it, how could one solve it? Of course, it was also possible to forcefully remove the lock, but it was like waving a knife to cut a rope knot or using a hammer to forcefully open a door. The lock could probably be opened, but the lock itself would not survive. After all, it was his own design, so it wasn't difficult to analyze it. Deciphering the mysteries of the soul through the guidance of stubborn and pure emotions, and then improving the soul to promote the evolution of the entire body. This is still my basic research idea. It was like a middle school student looking at the exercises they had done in elementary school. Perhaps the exercises were full of secret codes and scribbles, making it impossible for others to understand them. Perhaps they had long forgotten the specific content, but as long as they brought in their own thinking pattern and knowledge system, they would be able to decipher them. This is already related to the understanding of concepts and logic. In the end, I even managed to elevate the Evelyns from a single individual to the concept of an entire species. Every new Evelyn is an evolution of the entire species. It would seem that I reached the peak of the myth rank back in the day. Stop blowing your own trumpet and think of a solution. Don't you see that people are already looking at you strangely? Indeed, even though everyone in front of me was someone I was familiar with, and many of them were even my subordinates, all of them were looking at me with confused and unfriendly expressions. This was especially so for Little Red, who was even rubbing her palms together and itching to fight me. It was as if she was saying, "I finally have a chance to give you a good beating." What? Why are you looking at me like that? What did you do? Only then did I notice that after a month of torment, Diana had actually arrived. At this moment, she was also looking at me with an unfriendly expression. Even though she was questioning me with an angry tone, Diana's emotions were still very stable. It seems that she had indeed grown a lot. I just don't know why Victoria had already hidden herself in a corner and was staring at me with a face full of fear. Little Red, on the other hand, was smiling maliciously. Enough with the nonsense. Let me punch you a few times to vent my anger. As for my explanation, I'll listen to it after I'm done. What did I do? Isn't it just a physical examination for Shirley? Is this how you check? I lower my head to see that Shirley was in my hand. She was looking at me with a face full of fear. Next to her was a pile of what used to be clothes, and so I came to a sudden realization. I then silently took off my shirt and let her wear it, showing off my gentlemanly demeanor. Gentlemanly? The hell? Would a gentleman suddenly go berserk and rush into a woman's room, subdue her, and then strip her naked before staring at her? You even have the face to call yourself a gentleman after being so perverted in front of so many people. Even Bayphone wouldn't do such a thing. Now that I thought about it, that did seem to be the case. My mind was a complete mess as I directly rushed to Shirley's room and began inspecting her. Of course, in order to make it easier to inspect her, I had to at least take off her clothes. Even when everyone heard my screams and rushed over, I was still seriously inspecting her. I seemed to see many white things on her body. Bayphone wouldn't do such a thing? That's because Bayfing's targets are mostly naked. Fine, I won't argue anymore. If I told you that I was inspecting her with the attitude of a researcher, would you believe me? Fine, I'll kneel down. Don't hit me in the face. And so, Little Red took this opportunity to vent her anger as she kept muttering to herself. I wouldn't believe anyone else's words, but I believe yours. You're definitely not a normal person. Then why are you still hitting me? I soaked in lava in a volcano for an entire week, and I almost fainted. Didn't you do all of this? All right then. I was rendered speechless. Little Red was clearly taking advantage of this opportunity to vent her anger. But for some reason, I felt rather happy that Little Red trusted my noble character so much. Still, the silly cat kept shouting in my ear, which made me feel rather terrible. Idiot, she's saying that you're not a man. I am. Try me if you don't believe me. Forget it. I'm not Bayphone. I don't need to bother with a cat. For the rest of the time, the true dragon duel turned into a chinchilla duel. Lust, Cher was the true eldest sister of the 7 original sins, as well as the original form of the other original sins. When I first obtained sufficient information, I also understood the foundational nature of this curse. This wasn't a pure curse to begin with. It was a type of blessing related to evolution. Just like how I had given the wood spirits a curse of sin during their evolution, it was actually a type of blessing for evolution. That was also the result of my research. From the very start, my research results were probably the exact opposite of what the Holy Church taught me. The Holy Church told me that humans needed to control their own desires and instincts, but I believe that desires and instincts were an essential part of humanity. They were also the initial driving force behind human society's evolution. And the creation of these original sins was the mutual needs of the soul and physical body. Actually, this was how the core theories of the 7 original sins came about. Adang was capable of evolving by devouring other creatures. Bastion was capable of using anger to strengthen himself. Greed was capable of evolving by increasing the number and species of a species. And Pride was capable of transforming his entire species into a part of himself, using the power of the entire species to complete his evolution. Although envy hadn't been fully constructed yet, it was also the path of stealing, combining, and evolving. The original sins that represent humanity's instincts are the source of evolution. This was the core of my personal theory. However, many God's churches, including the Holy Church, believe that all humans are born with original sins. Only through suffering can one's sins be atoned for, and one will finally be freed and redeemed after death. Obviously, this was a complete contradiction. It was impossible to say who was right and who was wrong, but at the very least, my research had produced results. My 7 original sins had the common trait of self-evolution. Yes, as long as I left them alone and allowed them to freely grow, who knew what level they would evolve to? However, growth was usually limited by time. After all, I was only slightly more than 300 years old, while Adang, the oldest of the 7 original sins, was only 200 years old. Compared to the incredibly long lifespan that I expected, it was obvious that my growth period was still too short. And if I had to rank the individual combat strength of the 7 original sins, the strongest would be the oldest Adang, followed by the true eldest brother Bastion. Omar, who had been active for the shortest amount of time, had the lowest individual combat strength. Back in the underground world, I already knew that Adang had semi-god combat strength, and that he had more than one semi-god form. Yes, the ranking of their combat strength was basically based on their birth order. This wasn't because my craftsmanship was getting worse and worse. It was simply because the older they were, the more time and opportunities they would have to evolve and grow. And now, the true eldest sister had appeared. In theory, her lifespan had already reached close to 300 years, which meant that she had the longest amount of time to evolve. She should have displayed the abilities that a mature original sin should have. However, she didn't seem to have the strength to even fight a chicken. Fine, I knew that she was an archmage, but when I stripped her naked, she screamed like a little girl who had never seen blood before. How could that be considered an original sin? No, you can't look at it like that. Back in the day, although I only wanted to revive Evelyn, I used the exact same method that I used to create the original sins. This means that Cher is also capable of evolving, and the result of her evolution is that her entire species will evolve. From a certain standpoint, both Cher and Omar are special forms of evolution with their entire species as a unit. And if I count Lust as one of the 10 Evelyn sisters, then just these 10 Evelyn sisters alone would be enough to fight against all the other original sins combined. That 3-headed dragon gave me an aura that was above that of a semi-god, and that incessantly chattering copper dragon seemed to be in existence on the level of an immemorial dragon. With just a quick calculation, I had at least 7 to 10 semi-god level combat strength. Evelyn's family's combat strength would be astonishing. No wonder she was able to become one of the Dragon World's elders. And if my inference was correct, the Evelyns and Cher were now 2 sides of the same coin. They formed a single species, and every time a new member was born, the entire species would rapidly develop. And the theoretical basis for the rapid evolution of power levels was based on Cher's own soul and emotions, as well as the accumulation of every single Evelyn species. Perhaps this was a two-way mechanism. Not only was Cher creating Evelyns, the Evelyn's accumulation would also become the foundation for the next generation of share. They were just like building blocks that kept getting taller and taller. Now that I had organized everything, I basically had an idea. However, I was now doubtful about how to continue my research. This wasn't because I didn't have an idea for how to solve this problem, but rather, it would be such a pity to stop just like this. Perhaps the next generation of Evelyns will be even stronger, a super Evelyn, a super Evelyn, a super 3 Evelyn. Can a dragon that has already reached such a level be able to evolve even further? Indeed, this was truly a pity. Back then, I had already set a goal for Evelyns to evolve. It was likely that luck had been a major factor in my success in creating Evelyns. At the very least, it would be impossible for me to replicate Evelyns. It was so rare for me to encounter an original sin that had been around for nearly 300 years. I should properly collect my research results and data. It would be such a pity to give up just like this. Even if I'm called the evil Banshee Queen, I'm still not as bad as you. Even if you've long since lost your moral integrity, you should at least have a lower limit. A lower limit? Can that be eaten? Relax, I'll complete Evelyn's request and help Cher survive. After all, I'm her father. Are you still not tired of this joke? It's fine as long as it's not an Anababa. Chapter 378. Due to a certain reason that everyone knows, the royal palace is currently in a state of chaos. However, it's still necessary to arrange a meeting with His Majesty Orlos. The meeting is expected to take place at 6 o'clock in the afternoon tomorrow. Also, this is the topic of discussion. Take a look and see if you agree. This is a letter from the Dragon World's elders. The assistance they wish to receive and the rewards they can pay are all listed here. However, I feel that we still need to discuss the details. At the very least, they wish to receive powerful sealing magic and mage's assistance. This is a record of the recent meetings with the higher-ups of the Bardi Empire. As the leader of the diplomatic group, I feel that it's necessary for you to understand the current situation. At the very least, please don't suddenly disappear again. This is a letter from the Cloud Tower. They want you to give an explanation for your 1-month absence. Also, these are personal letters from several archmages. Renee has already returned to Donlon, but Sluweir has sent a letter. They hope that you can summon back war and pride before the entire Antoon city is blown to smithereens. Perhaps it's acceptable for Queen Glena to come out and relax as a form of training. This is urgent information from Timlad. There's a problem with a new weapon design. They need you to make a decision. The details are listed in the attachment. Generally speaking, the new weapon's attack range has exceeded the maximum range. It seems that it has accidentally become a suicidal weapon. The Surface Beastmen have submitted a new letter and tribute to Donlon. It seems that they intend to sign a 30-year peace treaty. From a certain standpoint, the moment I finally appeared, all the administrative work that had been piling up for so long was now placed on top of my head. While I was lamenting that it was becoming more and more difficult to slack off, I also resolved to create a useful internal affairs department. Otherwise, I would die of exhaustion sooner or later. Die of exhaustion? That's less than 3 days of work per month for you. Every department has already taken care of their own matters. You're only given specific tasks that are related to you. If you were slightly more responsible, we wouldn't have to work so hard. Fortunately, I brought Lilith Milan with me this time. Although she was as merciless with her words, she did indeed help me quite a bit after she finished nagging me. And what she said was indeed the truth. Some of these tasks were related to my diplomatic status in the Mage Country, some were related to the decision of the Donlon royalty, and some were related to my personal armed forces. Even if I had 10 secretaries, I would still have to personally deal with these tasks. As to why I had such a mountain of documents before me, it was because I had far too many things to do. In a way, this was a good thing. The newly born Mist Alliance, the Church of Law, the Underground, and so on had already faintly formed a solid alliance. But at the same time, the rapid growth would also bring about the negative effect of unstable foundations. At least among these factions, there were too many factors that were linked by personal feelings. Although it did indeed deepen the cooperation between the two sides, if something suddenly happened to an important person, such as me suddenly being killed, I'm afraid it would be a big problem. However, it would be quite difficult to make decisions for me. Eliza, who would have been the most suitable candidate to be my substitute, had to return to the chaos abyss. The other members of the younger generation would at most be able to take charge of a department. It would be impossible for them to take charge of the overall situation. It would seem that it's indeed time to reorganize all the factions. I'll split them into several roles and share a portion of my authority. Even if I die, everything will be able to continue as normal. Right, it's also time to reorganize the military. It's far too archaic to rely on a single commander to lead the troops. I seriously considered how to share the responsibilities, but someone couldn't bear to watch this any longer. You're saying so much just because you want to slack off. I suddenly recalled that you, silly cat, also have the title of Wise One. Why don't you try helping out? Stop joking. If you let me do it, I'll restore the Elven Empire from back in the day. Back in the day, I would probably first defeat the entire kingdom of the elves and the Elven Church, along with the guts of those disgusting elven gods and high elven royalty. The silly cat's lazy voice echoed in my mind. However, I knew that she was being serious. Not only that, she was already one step away from becoming a semi-god undead emperor. It was just that I, her master, had forcefully restrained her. If I truly allowed her to do as she pleased, it would likely be quite difficult to resolve the situation. However, I was rather curious about the semi-god undead emperor threshold. My research was based on the quality of one's soul, while 0 was based on the temperature of one's life. It could be said that she had already made breakthroughs in both soul and life. How is the silly cat intending to reach this threshold? My research? It's not that I can't give it to you, but even if I give it to you, you won't be able to understand it. I became even more curious. Although my research on elemental magic was quite average, I was quite well-versed in undead magic. How could I possibly not understand? Of course, I asked her about it. Memories and making the fake Real. All right then. I knew that I wouldn't need to ask her any further. Although this was also considered the soul, I didn't have any research results on it. Doesn't that mean it can cure amnesia or something? That's completely unrelated. My research goal is to use memories to create reality. It's quite easy for me to give you a memory that's completely original to me. Are you sure you want it? The silly cat was still lazily rolling around on the roof. Ever since she had leveled up again, she seemed to have become much lazier. A memory that comes from someone else? Would I still be me in that case? If your physical body is the original, your soul is the same, and even your memories are the same, then what's the point of being the original? I think there's still a difference. Can you tell the difference? Both of us fell silent. It was impossible to answer this question. However, this wasn't just a simple theoretical discussion. We both simultaneously thought of Evelyn. Was that dragon the original Evelyn? If she wasn't, then what was she? Sigh, I'm so conflicted. Roland, you should do less evil in the future. Can you blame me for this? Back then, I didn't understand anything about the river Styx or the cycle of reincarnation. I thought that reassembling my physical body and soul would naturally mean resurrection. And I ended up like this. It's obvious that I messed up. Then, how do you intend to deal with Evelyn now? Your second lover? What can I do? I'll just pretend that I don't know anything for now. What I regret the most right now is that I left your child body there, and it just so happened that I overheard what she said. How could I believe what others said? How is that possible? I had already lost that part of my memories. Even if the other party was Evelyn or my mother, there would be no evidence. Didn't all television dramas add a lot of settings when the other party lost their memories? Of course, I had to find out more about Evelyn. And so, I had Harloise do what she had always done and leave a child body there to eavesdrop. The result was that I overheard something that made me even more conflicted. Forget it. Let's not think about it. Let's deal with the current situation first. Let's think about Ascension first. Wasting more than a month wasn't completely useless. Since we were going to make a deal, we naturally needed to have a bargaining chip. The dragons wanted the Titans to remain as stone statues, or at the very least, slow down the time it took for them to revive. In that case, there were only two possible solutions. The first was to strengthen the seal and add another layer of seal on top of the seal. This would basically mean directly fighting against the Titans. It was easy to imagine just how difficult this would be. My strongest sealing spell, the Seal of the Four Elements, originated from the immemorial generation. In fact, even the Titans were sealed using this spell. However, I didn't believe that the long-lived dragons would be completely ignorant of this problem. The immemorial dragons were excellent mages as well. If they didn't have a solution, it was highly unlikely that we would have a solution. The other method would be to slow down the rate at which the four elemental gods would break the seal. This would allow the four elemental gods to regain their balance, and the fire elemental gods' elemental throne would at least be undamaged. The worst-case scenario would be the earth elemental god's throne, and so I naturally thought of a method to help an earth elemental lord ascend to become a god. Previously, this would have been quite difficult. After all, we would still need to gather materials to reconstruct the elemental throne. However, due to the wind elemental god's generosity, we now had an even better solution, the god equipment of Earth. As for why I didn't go to the wind elemental plane right now, I felt like the moment I went, the system would definitely give me an epic rank quest. I didn't even know how long it would take for me to complete it. At any rate, the dragons are more impatient than we are. They're probably in desperate need of a solution to their problem. If we provide them with a solution, won't we have ready-made helpers? However, mere words wouldn't be enough. Problems such as, can the god equipment of Earth create the elemental throne? Who should be the next elemental god? Will the new elemental god be able to reach a balance between the elements? Will he be able to slow down the collapse of the Titan giant's sealed dimension? And so on would all need to be researched. Fine then, this was beyond the authority that the Truth Symposium had given me, as well as my own abilities. That was why I sent a report back to the Truth Symposium and had them slowly research it. Over the past month, the Truth Symposium's Earth element mages were probably exhausted to the point of death. But judging from the information I just received and the expert suggestions, this plan had at least received the Truth Symposium's approval. Feasibility was one thing, but now that I had the approval, that meant that regardless of whether or not I could solve the problem, if there was a problem, everyone would take the blame together instead of me taking the blame alone. Naturally, I could rest assured and continue working on this matter. On the other hand, if we were to face any possible battles in the elemental planes or dragon world, I would be rather weak right now. That was why I had long since written a letter to the Truth Symposium. Reinforcements should be arriving soon. Slower actually wants his queen to come out and relax. It would seem that John and Galena are getting along quite well. The number of explosions must have increased quite a bit recently. Asterisk boom. Asterisk yep. Judging from that familiar gray mushroom cloud in the outskirts of the city, they had already arrived. Pervert. All right then, what a familiar female scream. But since there were far too many subordinates who fit this description, I really didn't know who had arrived. Something seemed off. Could it be that I was naturally attracted to such people? I was clearly a normal person, a Tauran without any clothes. All right then, I more or less knew who had arrived. A centaur without any clothes. Cassio, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? You can't be like this. 2 years ago, when your grandfather handed you over to me, you were clearly a normal person. I'm going to welcome them. Eaglestorm stood up and walked over, but I angrily shouted at him. Put on some pants before you go. Chapter 379. Dark elves were quite troublesome, but what was even more troublesome than dark elves was the prejudice of the world. A large crowd had already gathered in front of the carriages. When a sword-wielding Bardi royal knight asked me what was going on, I furrowed my eyebrows. Is it Victoria or Diana? Didn't I tell them not to go out for the time being? When I heard about dark elves, I naturally thought of Diana and Diana back home. In order to avoid trouble, I didn't have them leave my residence. However, neither Victoria nor Diana would be so obedient. Previously, the town security had also violated the city's rules. When I thought about how Diana had caused trouble again, I immediately got angry. So troublesome. Dark elves? It was quite difficult to correct a person's prejudices and habits, especially since most places in this world didn't have convenient communication and transportation. Once a person's prejudices and common sense were formed, it would be impossible to change them. In some remote areas, it was even common for a dynasty from 3 or 4 centuries ago to still be used. Although Rose had collapsed, that didn't mean that the Dark Elves were completely innocent. Most human kingdoms still treated Dark Elves and devils the same way. If they were captured, they would burn them to death and then collect evidence of their crimes. If this was any other region, no matter if it was the Ottoman Empire or the Northlands, they would at least give me some face. But here, what happened? I had the knight lead the way and push through the crowd. As expected, I saw a dark-skinned person. Diana, who are you? All right then. It would seem that I was mistaken. The person being surrounded was an unfamiliar male dark elf. His grayish-black skin was covered in light burns. It was obvious that he hadn't undergone any moonlight ritual. He collapsed on the ground and seemed to be unable to move. I only wanted to live in seclusion in this city. I didn't do anything. However, it was obvious that his begging for mercy was treated as an excuse. The citizens holding their pitchforks were looking at him with fear and disgust. Some naughty children were even throwing stones at him from afar. Some people even tried tossing torches at him. He didn't have Rose's emblem on him, nor did he have any emblem of any good god. If it wasn't for the fact that he was hiding his faith, then he was a rare, non-believer elf. I saw him concoct poison in his small wooden house. He even dares to sell poison everywhere. If he forgets to wear his evil magic mask, we will be fooled by him again. A freckled, brown-haired young man pointed at him and shouted angrily, "That's just a potion for treating injuries. Didn't you use it before? You even praised the effects of this medicine before." It seemed like the Dark Elves had successfully taken root in this city, but it was unknown whether they had leaked it or not. Yes, but you didn't mention those evil magic potions. Although my external injuries were healed, I had diarrhea for 3 days and was extremely weak. What you gave me was an evil potion that overdrew my life. Pooh! I used to think that you were a good person. I was really blind. The burly man looked as if he could not bear to look back. I've lived in this city for 10 years, and I've done nothing. If I did something... The moment he said this, the situation immediately turned for the worse. Earlier, some people had been acting as if this matter had nothing to do with them, but now that they heard that the Dark Elves had actually been living here for 10 years and thought about how the evil Dark Elves have been living here for so long, the crowd immediately boiled over. No wonder there are so many missing persons cases in this district. They've all been used as guinea pigs by this dark-skinned man. I'm saying that there have been so many burglaries recently. Perhaps he's also the one who burglarized me. Could it be that I'm still unable to give birth to a child because of this evil dark elf's poisonous witchcraft? Although this seemed quite ridiculous from a certain standpoint, this was the reality of this generation. Even in the Middle Ages, where technology was incredibly advanced, things were similar. A certain child was rumored to have been cursed, and in the end, even the pigs in his village had deformities. This was the result of prejudice and ignorance. If that child is Beifong, then it really isn't slandering him. You don't say. I also thought of this possibility. Forget it. Let's not slander him. He's so pitiful. I asked him before, and he said that he's not interested in pigs. You actually asked him before? But do you really believe what he says? He even says that he's normal. By the way, if we keep watching and chatting like this, he's going to get beaten to death. It was unknown who attacked first, but the result was a rain of pitchforks and stones. If it wasn't for the fact that this dark elf had some skills, he would have definitely died. Wait, this guy isn't even fighting back. Does he want to die that badly? The will of the strong flowed through their bloodline. Just their anger alone was enough to make ordinary people feel fear. This was a common trait of all gold-ranked martial job classes. It wasn't strange for this dark elf to be a gold-ranked warrior job class. Since he had arrived here 10 years ago, it was evident that he was no noob since he had been able to survive here for 10 years. But what was rather strange was that this dark elf didn't even fight back or try to escape. This made me wonder how he had managed to survive here on the surface. I checked to make sure that this wasn't a trap set up by a certain someone, so I decided to intervene. But please make way, please make way. A rather handsome young man wearing extravagant clothing pushed through the crowd and entered. His red hair was neatly combed, and the knife wound on his face didn't disfigure him at all. In fact, it made him seem even more valiant. Judging from his aura, his personal power level was between the peak of silver and half gold. Considering that he wasn't even 35 years old yet, he could be considered a genius among humans. He wore extravagant golden armor that was more for decoration than for actual combat. He also had a myth-ranked weapon at his waist, and there were 2 followers behind him who were at least at the silver rank. The 27th Prince. It's His Highness Mills. Judging from the reactions of the surrounding people, the person who had volunteered to participate was actually a prince. Judging from everyone's reactions, he was quite famous. At the very least, the residents of this business district were giving him face. Of course, since I was acting as a diplomat, I had done my homework beforehand. Although Mills ranked quite low among my brothers and was rather low-key among the princes, he was actually one of the top 5 successors to the throne. In the current infighting among the princes, some princes had their hands on the royals' military, while others had policies that favored the major merchants. However, of course, the majority of princes were in cahoots with the major nobles. Mills was one of the better ones. He had accomplished many accomplishments on the battlefield in his early years, which was why Orlas personally honored him and took him in as his adopted son. Unlike his other brothers who tried their best to take the path of the upper echelons of society and reign in their power, Roland had the natural advantage of being born in the military. He often appeared in the busy streets, either judging villains like a holy knight, ranger, or acting like a hero saving a damsel in distress like a prince in a legendary story, or fighting against illegal merchants. Roland's legendary deeds were often recorded in the songs of the bards on the streets. That's right, legendary feats. This wasn't the underground where legends were everywhere. A gold-rank grandmaster who wasn't even 40 years old was more than capable of performing heroic feats that would be praised by the world. In fact, some citizens even petitioned Orlas to make Mills the crown prince. However, in my opinion, no. In the opinion of many powerful individuals, Mills wasn't as pure and kind as he appeared to be. The bards who were in charge of flattering Mills were all sponsored by him. The relatives of the petitioners were all working for Mills. The most important part was how much luck did Mills have in order to save a damsel in distress every time she was in danger. Every time a scheme was about to be carried out, he would suddenly see through everything and twist the situation. If he didn't arrange it himself, then he must have many spies all over the city, constantly waiting for something to happen in order to increase his reputation. Considering that the other princes wouldn't simply watch as Mills set up a fake scheme to increase his reputation, I was more inclined to believe that Mills had many spies under his command. Judging from the situation, it seemed that Mills was here to increase his reputation again. What do you think he'll do? From his information, I can only think of him as a pure politician. A pure politician would never do what he wants to do. Instead, he'll say whatever the people want him to do. That way, he'll receive support and be able to rise to power. In that case, since the people want to execute this dark elf, why wouldn't he do something so easy to increase his reputation? Perhaps we'll even be able to hear the bards sing, "A prince furiously slays a dark elf tomorrow." That's really too much. Shouldn't a normal trial be conducted according to procedure? Haha, do you think politicians are normal? At this moment, the Bardy Knight who was protecting us simply watched coldly from the sidelines. Since he was a member of the royal family, he had an indifferent expression as he watched this scene, as if it had nothing to do with him. I could almost see Orlas's attitude towards the princes from this. Sure enough, it was Prince Mills who shouted loudly with his sword in hand. "Everyone retreat. Be careful of the dark elf's evil curse." An enchantment then flashed on his sword. It seemed that Mills really was going to furiously slay the dark elf. But the strange thing was that even at this moment, the dark elf gritted his teeth and fell to the ground, not intending to run away. At this point, this farce was getting rather boring. Compared to the prince furiously slays a dark elf scenario, I preferred the "a politician prince accidentally ran into an iron wall and got viciously beaten up." But just as I was about to take action, another angry roar interrupted my actions. Why did I say another? Law incantation, judgment, sin-breaking strike. 3 cloaked individuals instantly jumped in front of Mills from a nearby rooftop. One of them roared angrily and attacked Mills with his thick sword. Another ran over to cast a divine art, seemingly intending to heal the injured dark elf. As for the last cloaked individual, he simply glared at the surrounding spectators. Just his aura alone was enough to make the prince's follower unable to move, causing the spectators to instinctively retreat, forcefully immobilizing a silver rank. An unknown saint-ranked individual who's at least 2 ranks higher than a silver rank. This time, even the Bardi royal knights watching from the sidelines were astonished. As for me, this was such a familiar Judgment Paladins combo, such a familiar teamwork, and even the aura of a saint-ranked individual. Jan, Diana, Victoria, all of you snuck out as expected, but now wasn't the time to cause trouble for them. From a certain standpoint, it would be more convenient for them to do this, since they had hidden their identities. Not only that, they knew how to handle this situation. At the very least, that was what I believed at this moment. I also secretly took a step back. With Diana, a new saint-ranked anti-saint knight, taking action, nobody would be able to stop them. And I was quite confident in Diana's ability to handle things. But sometimes, the heavens would always plan better than humans. Unexpected things would always happen in places that nobody expected. God weapon, Dragon Slayer blade. Attack power, 0 to 35 quality, epic, special effect, unstoppable, 100% chance to directly cut through any weapon below excellent. 50% chance to cut through an excellent weapon. 30% chance to cut through an epic weapon. 1% chance to cut through any weapon below God equipment. Special effect, life-stealing radiance. Yes, it's life-stealing radiance, not dazzling radiance. With this blade, you'll become a main character in the eyes of the world. Yep, a tragic main character. The wielder's luck stat will be reduced by 10. Charm stat will be increased by 10. If the wielder is a blonde male, they'll lose an additional 10. Special effect, Berserk Madness. 1% chance to enter a berserk state where you won't even recognize your family. You'll prioritize hunting down your family. There's a string of yellow words on the hilt of the blade. In ancient legends, this was once a divine weapon that symbolized status. The most revered of all, the treasured blade, Dragon Slayer. But now, there's a new interpretation of the term. Blade Dragon Slayer. Click and you'll get it for free. Doubtlessly, this was an excellent blade, but due to its disgusting negative effects that would turn the wielder into a lunatic, only Jan, who was naturally resistant to berserk, was able to use it. She had always treated this blade as her own treasure. Anyone who encountered this blade for the first time and didn't know its special effects would be at a disadvantage. The current captain of the town security team would be able to challenge someone of a higher power level than him with this blade. Perhaps it was because Mills had done too many bad things, but his luck was truly terrible. His long sword and Shio's gift had already surpassed the power limit of myth-ranked. This meant that Jan only had a 1% to 3% chance of cutting through this blade. Yet it just had to activate at this moment. Asterisk clang. Asterisk the sword and the blade clashed. The first slash activated the Berserk Madness effect, which caused Mill's myth-ranked weapon to directly break in half. The thick blade continued slicing towards Mill's face. Jan hurriedly stopped when she saw this. After all, she was only here to save Mills. She didn't want to kill the prince. However, as an excellent judgment knight, she used the golden combination of law incantation, judgment, and crime slashing before she attacked. The former would judge the victim's actions within the last 2 hours. If the victim committed a crime, a red light representing the crime would appear on their body. The greater the crime, the redder the light would be. Meanwhile, the latter would attach the power of law to the blade of the sword and attack the sinner. The greater the crime, the greater the damage. I didn't know what Mills had done in the last 2 hours, but the reddish-purple color on his body proved that he had definitely just committed a heinous crime. Yet, the Judgment Knight just happened to use a crime slashing at such a time. If crime slashing struck someone who was innocent, it would only be a slight push. In fact, the blade would even automatically become blunt. However, if the target was a vicious criminal, it would be an unstoppable killing move. At this moment, Jan was unable to stop even if she wanted to. The law was merciless. Since the Judgment Knight who used crime slashing was the representative of the law, and since law incantation, judgment had already marked out the most heinous criminal, how could Jan possibly stop her crime slashing due to her personal will? And so, Jan's silver sword transformed into a crescent moon that sliced towards Mill's face. If this slash landed, it would definitely cut him in half. Meanwhile, Mill's true bodyguards had already started moving. The Royal Knight wouldn't just watch as the prince was killed right in front of them. Mills had also activated his own life-saving magical item. As long as he blocked this attack, or if his helpers arrived in time, he would still be able to survive. However, it just so happened that Diana had used her newly obtained ability in order to make the prince's bodyguard stop. Aura ability, anti-holy barrier. Summon a barrier created from willpower. This barrier will dispel the magic and divine power effects within it. The barrier's effectiveness will be determined by the difference in power level between the user and the target. Duration, medium. This barrier stood between Mill's helpers and Mills. At this moment, Mill's helpers were one step too slow in transforming into ordinary humans. Mill's protective item lit up for a moment before extinguishing. The silver power of law on his Dragonslayer's sword, which was already outside the barrier, dimmed slightly, but he still continued to slash down. Asterisk crack. Asterisk the sword landed on the ground and was sliced in half. Blood gushed out and dyed the ground red. All right then, even though I said so much, only one thing actually happened in the eyes of the ordinary citizens. A cloaked assassin suddenly jumped out and slashed down with his sword, slicing the esteemed Prince Mills into 2 pieces of meat. Assassin. Assassin. Someone killed His Highness Mills. Amidst the chaos, a fierce wind blew up the edges of Jan's cloak, revealing the astonished, black-skinned Jan. Save me. A dark elf killed His Highness. That dark elf I recognized. That sword. It's that mage country's ambassador's bodyguard. Someone from the mage country killed His Highness Mills. At this moment, Jan was astonished. Diana was astonished. Victoria was astonished. The Royal Knight was astonished. Even I myself was stunned. There was a sentence that he had heard before, but for some reason, it kept reverberating in his head. When the Austro-Hungarian Empire's crown prince, Archduke Ferdinand, and his wife were assassinated, nobody expected that this would be a purely unexpected incident. The assassination of an unpopular prince from a small country would actually become the fuse for a world war that would engulf all of Europe. Damn it, Jan, you idiotic girl with luck. This is going to be fun. Chapter 380. The reason why unexpected events were called unexpected was because they would often come without any warning and result that no one could accept. Back in the day, Ferdinand himself hadn't been important. Even his death or the Austro-Hungarian Empire's revenge wouldn't have been enough to affect the entire world. Back then, the international situation was already on the brink of war. Many countries were making preparations for war, and some were even preparing to start a war. And so, when this reason appeared, the Kaiser excitedly ignited the powder keg for war. Russia and France also acted, and the entire world was swept into war. Actually, this was still the case now. Barty wasn't in a good situation. Internationally, it was facing enemies on 3 sides. The mage country was currently fighting in the west, while the undead in the south were organizing a new wave of attacks against Nitrain City. The vanguard of the Holy War was still waiting in the east. As if all these weren't enough trouble, there was also the Dragon World and Titan giants sealed away in the capital city. They were a ticking time bomb that could blow up the entire country at any moment. In this generation where strength equaled wealth, the citizens of this powerful country had already been treated unjustly since last year, as they didn't have to worry about food or clothing. The citizens' resentment accumulated, and their anxiety grew. In fact, they even wanted to fight but couldn't. They wanted to use victory to vent their anger, which was why they were so disrespectful towards other countries' ambassadors. The surrounding countries' declarations of war made them feel like they were on the verge of collapse. However, they also felt pride and anger at being the enemy of the entire world. This wasn't just ordinary people. This included nobles, knights, and so on. Merchants hoped to get rich. Nobles hoped to reshuffle the power structure. Knights hoped to accomplish great things. And princes hoped to obtain achievements that would allow them to obtain the crown. They also hoped to take advantage of the fact that other princes were on the front lines to obtain the crown. And all of this was suppressed by the old and decrepit Emperor Orlos. Perhaps I often acted recklessly, but the truth was that every time I acted recklessly, I would always consider the situation and the consequences. I would always plan before taking action, which was also commonly known as thinking too much, was my personal style. This seemed quite difficult to deal with, and it also gave me a lot of unnecessary trouble. It would be quite direct. You think that I'm crazy because you don't understand me. If you understood me, you'd probably want to beat me to death. I digressed. Getting back to the main topic, I had already decided on my basic strategy for coming to Bardi, to appear aloof but actually docile, to appear distant but actually close. To be specific, it was to put on a high profile as much as possible and put on a "I don't want to deal with you country bumpkins" attitude. Then he would use a middleman to go back and forth, raise the price, and finally close the deal. From a certain standpoint, the slime calamity was meant to cool down the capital, which is why I had ordered my subordinates and those bastards to quiet him down and do their best to reduce the possibility of any accident happening. Yet, I didn't expect such a huge incident to occur. How will the Bardi nobles and royalty react? Follow the will of the people and launch a new round of war, or suppress the matter to obtain more bargaining chips in the negotiations? What would the local nobles do? Would they pressure the royal family to take revenge? Also, what would the faction that Mills colluded with do? There were far too many possibilities, and I was momentarily stunned. But as I watched the Bardi Royal Knight urgently rush over and the dimensional door that suddenly opened, I at least knew what I needed to do. At the very least, I couldn't allow myself to be caught red-handed. Harlois create chaos. I need time to summon my daughter. A smokescreen is fine as well. While the Dark Elves were in a daze, numerous powerhouses had arrived, and the court mages were stepping out of the teleportation gate. Then, they unhesitatingly stepped into the shadows, and when they reappeared in front of everyone, they were wearing blood-red dragon armor. Honestly, I thought that I'd at least look cooler for my first appearance. I stood there and single-handedly blocked the Bardi Royal Knight's charge. I casually swung my sword to force them back, and a wall of ice appeared that could stop them for several seconds at the very least. The air that I breathed was filtered by the dragon armor, turning into dragon vein flames and blue frost. Compared to the past, the ice dragon armor that Arabella had transformed into seemed to faintly increase my ice attribute. Idiots, follow me. I'll deal with you later. I intentionally lowered my voice, making it sound even stranger through my armor. However, I knew that they would definitely recognize me. And at this moment, Victoria was still dragging the injured dark elf. Take him with you. Black smoke filled the air, and both sides of the street were ablaze with smoke. Heloise was indeed experienced in creating chaos. Why aren't you leaving yet? When I turned around to look, I discovered that the dark elf wasn't escaping at all. He was using his cloak and body to protect a little girl. Judging from the girl's grayish-brown skin and human-like round ears, she was a mixed blood. Take them all with you. I'll cover the rear. Asterisk boom. Asterisk at this moment. The royal mages had already walked out of the dimensional door and were constantly summoning fireballs. The ice walls were already cracking, and the mages were also summoning a strong gale to blow away the smoke. Ha ha! The poison dragon Shamar, actually didn't have to personally take action. Just a few noobs were enough to kill off this idiot. As expected of the so-called hero prince. This was such an easy deal. I continuously swung my long sword, sending out sword energy infused with ice magic. However, I was inwardly rejoicing that I had habitually overthought things. If it wasn't for the fact that I had investigated the name of the Dragon Bloodline Sword Saint, who was also an assassin, it would have been difficult for me to find someone to take the blame for me. Of course, why would a desert bandit from the West come all the way to the center of the continent to assassinate a prince? Even though he clearly had a green dragon bloodline, how could he have red dragon bloodline abilities and ice magic? This would be quite difficult to explain, but there was actually no need to explain. What I needed was a cover. Even if that cover could be seen through by everyone and no one would believe it, only with this cover on the surface would we have room for further negotiations. If the assassin was caught on the spot, it was likely that there would be no way to negotiate, and the relationship between the two countries would be greatly affected. But obviously, I couldn't count on the furious Barty citizens to think things through. Right now, they only wanted to take revenge and catch the assassin. Large amounts of smoke obscure my vision. The Sword Saint of the Royal Knight group was also using sword energy to counterattack me, but he didn't even attempt to block it. That Sword Saint, who had just leveled up not long ago, was so far away from me. It would be impossible for him to pierce through my armor. On the other side, the court mages who had just walked out of the dimensional gate were obstructed by the chaotic crowd. They were then countered by the damned cat, who was already prepared. It would be difficult for them to free themselves in a short period of time. I could sense that the Dark Elves had already left. Of course, I had no intentions of staying behind. Their prince had been assassinated right in front of them. The Royal Knight, who valued honor as much as their lives, would definitely take action. There were quite a few good ones among them. As long as I could see again, it would be difficult for me to leave even if I wanted to. Dragon wings. The blood-red dragon wings on my armor seemed to have grown out of my back. I was once again thankful for the dragon bloodline ability that my armor had. Otherwise, it would be quite difficult to explain why I had to use angel wings. Ninth Prince, I've completed the mission you gave me. Remember to pay me. Otherwise, you'll end up just like Prince Mills. I casually tossed the blame onto Shamar again, and then declared this incident to be a prince's murder. I then leapt up from the ground, and the mages summoned a thunderstorm that passed under me. Weren't you all quite capable? Why aren't you saying anything now? Don't you know that this attack of yours will likely start a war? My angry roar echoed in the cabin. Diana, Yawn, and Victoria were all kneeling in front of me with their heads lowered, as if they were little kids being scolded. Nearby, Shirley was lying on the side. When she heard that Diana had killed Prince Mills in public, she immediately fainted, while the other heartless B** stars were still gloating over Diana's misfortune. Of course, it was impossible for me to return to my residence. That would be the same as handing my life over to someone else. Fortunately, Galena had returned from the Northlands on a small assault airship. In order to make it more convenient for Diana and Victoria to come see me, Renee had also sent an assault airship. The end result was that we still had a few airships with us, which meant that we could still escape. I left a few people at the diplomatic group's residence, while everyone else stayed on the airship. Should I say that, as expected of experienced bandits, their escape abilities were maxed out, and they had already made preparations as soon as the incident occurred. They were actually waiting for us on the airship. I already told you not to go out on the streets, so why did you still go out? You're completely undisciplined and unorganized, Diana. You're the head. How are you supposed to lead a team like this? I continue to berate them, but I was actually thinking of a way to deal with this situation. Actually, there was no way to deal with this situation. It was obvious who was responsible for this case, and there was no way to deny it. It all depended on how they intended to deal with it. Damn it, they've completely taken the initiative. As for why I was berating them, actually, I didn't feel that the Dark Elves had done anything wrong. Wasn't it only natural that the Dark Elves would be killed for their purplish-red light of sin? But now that the Dark Elves had made a mistake, if I didn't berate them and punish them, how would I be able to lead a team in the future? Head, stop pretending. Everyone knows that you're not angry. If you were really angry, you wouldn't have wasted your breath and directly attacked. If you continue, Big Sister Diana might take things too hard and commit suicide. Galena jumped out. However, it seemed that ever since she started hanging out with War and Pride, her words had become more and more masculine. Or perhaps I should say that they were more vulgar mercenaries. But from another perspective, she had become much livelier after removing the thread of the demon's power and freeing herself from the seal that bound her body and mind. No, committing suicide after making a mistake is an irresponsible action. I shall bear all the consequences with my own body. My lord, please hand us over to Barty. Diana raised her head and looked at me with an expression of calmness from the impending sacrifice. It would seem that although her resolution had improved, her intelligence hadn't improved. I suddenly didn't want to say anything else as I looked at this brave dark elf who had an expression of, "I'll take responsibility for my mistakes alone and don't drag others down with me," as well as my granddaughter, who was smiling cheekily as she tugged on my sleeve. "Forget it, I'll stop talking. I'll go to the city and see what's going on when the sun rises." Just as I made up my mind to go to the city tomorrow, someone came looking for me. "Is Roland here?" "Cher, why are you lying down?" "Mom?" Chapter 381. From a certain standpoint, Cher didn't tell me the truth either. At the very least, she didn't tell me everything. For instance, she said that her mother was a three-headed dragon, but she didn't tell me that she had 7 other mothers. If you were in my shoes, would you tell anyone that you had 10 mothers? Or 10? All right then. Her words were so logical that I was rendered speechless. When Cher and Evelyn were both in the same small cabin, and both mother and daughter seemed to be about the same age, even I couldn't help but sigh at how unpredictable the world was and how wondrous it was. However, Evelyn's arrival saved me a lot of trouble. I basically knew her identity now. She was currently one of the dragon's elders, but she lived in an underground cave near the capital city. Obviously, the Barty officials had tacitly agreed to this. She was most likely the bridge between the two. Judging from her smiling face and bronze-colored skin, this copper dragon's incarnation was most likely responsible for diplomacy. In that case, perhaps I could learn more about the Barty royalty's plans from her. After all, copper dragons are the most talkative out of all the dragons, so it would be perfect for her to act as a diplomat. Nice to meet you all. I'm Roland's ex-girlfriend, Evelyn, as well as Cher's mother. Cher, be good and call me Dad. The prerequisite was that copper dragons had to change their bad habits of joking around and pranking others. All right then, my mind was in a mess. I really didn't know how to explain this. Everyone looked at me in astonishment. From another perspective, it was difficult to refute her words. Evelyn was indeed my ex-girlfriend, and Cher was my creation as well as my daughter. But why did it feel like I was the scumbag who had abandoned her after using her? And so, Cher, who had just woken up, fainted yet again when she discovered that I had tacitly agreed, "Don't look at me like that. I'm really not scumbag. I'm still a virgin. The hell with being a virgin. Do whatever you want. Evelyn, it's all because of you." After the chaos subsided, our family was now complete. We had a father, a mother, an elder, and a younger one. We're not a family at all. All right then, let's temporarily forget about the past. Although my subordinates and granddaughters were looking at me more and more strangely, I had to take care of business first. There might be a war soon. Be more serious. Be more serious. Don't laugh. I'm talking about you, Gleena. Stop laughing. Come, Gleena, this Evelyn is your great-grandmother, and this Miss Shirley is your grandmother. You should at least greet them. This time, it was everyone's turn to feel bad. Looking at Gleena, who looked like she had a salted duck egg in her mouth, I nodded in satisfaction. You want to compete with me on how shameless I am? Well, I become shameless. Even I am afraid of myself. Grandma, I owe 17 years of pocket money in Grandpa's. All right then. As expected of my granddaughter, she was quite shameless as well. But the pitiful Cher just had to wake up at this exact moment, and she immediately fainted upon hearing me call her grandma. Looking at the chaos in front of me, I knew that if I didn't explain clearly, I wouldn't be able to get down to business. These people were too outrageous. Isn't this all your fault? You still have a cheek to say that. You are the source of all evil, the main culprit. The silly cat's words were far too reasonable. I was unable to refute her words at all. This is Evelyn. She died earlier, and in order to revive her, I created the eldest sister of the 7 original sins, lust share. Yep, that's her. From a certain standpoint, they are indeed mother and daughter. It's just that the mother is on Cher's side. So, in a way, Cher is indeed my daughter. Hey, Cher, at least listen to what I have to say before you faint. How many times do I have to say this? I've already used the phrase faint too many times already. When I learned about the messy past, I also hesitated about whether or not I should expose the truth or just leave it there. But then I thought of a problem and decided to expose the truth. At the very least, I can't have Cher become an illegitimate daughter. She'll be bullied in school. That's not the problem at all. Can you be a little more normal? The silly cat was becoming more and more like a retort slave. Her ability to retort was unparalleled. Isn't it all because of you? Cough, cough. Getting back to the main topic, everyone had already seen how unreliable I was. Apart from Omar, who wasn't here right now, which would probably be a little troublesome, the appearance of the eldest sister of the 7 original sins was quickly accepted by everyone. This was especially so when Galena grabbed Cher and asked her grandmother for some pocket money. This time, at the very least, Cher didn't faint from overeating. It was just that she looked at me as if she wanted to eat me up. Ignoring the family matters, the most important thing right now was still how the Barty royalty would deal with this situation. This was doubtlessly the most annoying part, and it just so happened that we had given the choice to the Barty royalty, meaning that we could only passively deal with it. Yes, the matter of who was right or wrong was meaningless. Taking the initiative was the most important. Originally, we were the ones who had been invited to help the Barty royalty, so it was up to us to decide whether or not to negotiate with the Barty royalty. But now, if the Barty Empire refused to let go of this matter, or even directly turn it into a diplomatic incident, we would receive tremendous pressure. At the very least, the mage country would receive tremendous pressure. In that case, it was likely that I would no longer be an ambassador. Personally, I didn't care much about being an ambassador, but now that I had lost the mage country support, many things would be difficult to do. Orlos's intentions? How would I know? I was only here to play with Cher. All right, don't look at me like that. I do have some boring things to do. Let's find a place to talk. Unfortunately, the copper dragons were always so unreliable that I felt helpless. They always made it impossible to tell when they were discussing serious matters and when they were playing pranks. Why isn't it a proper bronze dragon or a silver dragon who's easy to get along with? 4th sister? She has to control her 5th and 6th sisters, who always go on a rampage. As for 2nd sister, she'll probably be in for a lot of trouble. I thought about it for a moment. It was basically impossible to hide the appearance of that 3-headed dragon, and 4th sister, the bronze dragon, seemed quite righteous. However, 5th sister and 6th sister were both red dragons and blue dragons. Both of them were troublemakers. Evelyn's example once again proved that the physical body could affect one's personality. When we arrived at the quiet room, yep, the narrow cockpit, only Cher, Evelyn, and me were present. I found Evelyn's first sentence rather incomprehensible. Actually, little Orlos is quite grateful to you. I paused in surprise for a moment, but then Evelyn explained the current situation to me. I was now a wanted criminal in the Barty Empire, and I indeed seemed to be the country's savior. If you hadn't come, the undead would still be suppressing the Barty Empire. That was indeed the truth. If I hadn't exposed the undead scheme, Undead Emperor Aso would likely still be the true ruler of the capital. However, I was rather astonished. The dragons are just going to watch the situation worsen? They have hostages. Hostages? Will the dragons care about something like that? Do you think they'd care if all the Barty citizens were hostages? Casolin's tears? Soon, I recalled that the Barty citizens' bodies contain a rather high amount of undead catalyst medicine. This was obviously related to the undead. As expected, you guys know about it. Casolin's tears is a special type of medicine. As long as the undead smell another kind of fragrance, they'll mutate into a new type of undead calamity. That's when the fun starts. There was no need to mention what an undead calamity was. If you looked at it on a smaller scale, it would be like a Resident Evil from another world. It was often taken care of by a few heroes who suddenly jumped out and became their stage of advancement. If you looked at it on a larger scale, it would be the switch between life and death. Everyone would turn into zombies, and skeletons. As professional undead mages, we can make an objective assessment of the undead calamity. From a certain standpoint, an undead calamity is similar to a plague. How much damage an undead calamity can cause is usually directly related to its initial size and the time it was discovered. If an undead calamity starts off as the size of a city, it would be sufficient to burn the entire city down. If the undead calamity was a major city with a population of several 100,000, the death toll would be in the millions. And if the undead calamity was a mega empire with a population of several 100 million, in the end, the entire world would probably be buried along with it. This wasn't simply a qualitative change caused by a large number of undead. This was a despair caused by pure probability. As long as there was a sufficient number of undead, it was possible to create high-level undead from low-level undead. Currently, it seemed that only 1 in 1,000 would be able to do so. And as long as there were enough high-level undead, undead lords and undead lords would naturally appear. This was said to be 1 in 10,000. As long as there were enough undead lords, even undead emperors would appear. Since there were far too few examples of this, it was impossible to calculate. As for whether or not there were any more ridiculous examples, that would depend on a large enough number of undead. And as long as there were enough high-level undead and undead lords, the newly born undead calamity wouldn't instinctively spread itself. Instead, it would form an undead army and begin invading the world, further expanding the undead calamity's influence. Fortunately, even up until now, the largest undead calamity had never exceeded 100 million. But if the Tark Republic's undead had truly succeeded, history would likely have been completely rewritten. Still, I felt that even if the Tark Republic's undead managed to create such a large-scale undead calamity, the world might not necessarily be destroyed. That was because this would have already surpassed the gods' bottom line. The Tark Republic would first have to deal with the true gods who had descended to the mortal world. Unless the Tark Republic had an undead emperor in the triple digits, it was unlikely that they would be able to defeat the combined forces of all the true gods. So, you dare to become enemies with the undead right now. It's all thanks to you forcing Aso to his death. Aso? Yep, he was the overall commander of the Tark Republic's invasion, as well as the inventor of this new undead calamity. When he died, he didn't leave behind any inheritors to inherit his knowledge. Since the key to opening the door of calamity was lost, Barty naturally had the confidence to say no to the undead. I paused for a moment and then hesitated. Finally, I said it out loud. If I tell you that I have the knowledge left behind by Aso, including the method to create that poisonous gas, what will Barty do? Chapter 382. This small cockpit seemed to be discussing important matters of the country. However, the people talking didn't seem to be paying much attention. Barty, Orlos wants us to hand over the culprit and deal with it as a personal grudge. Of course, the mage country also needs to sign some compensation agreements. At the very least, we need to apologize on the surface. Yep, I know you won't agree. At the very least, hand over the culprit. It's just a few dark elves. Otherwise, Orlos won't be able to explain himself to the mage country. I didn't know if it was because of her bronze dragon bloodline's natural disgust for dark elves, or if it was simply because she disliked the dark elves, but Evelyn didn't hold back at all. If you really understand me, you'll know that's impossible. I'm someone who can be persuaded by reason, not cowed by force. Fine. I can't be persuaded by either force or persuasion. You can call me protective or unreasonable, but I have no intention of handing over the culprit. I didn't believe that they had done anything wrong at all. Since my subordinates hadn't done anything wrong, how could I possibly back down as their superior? So what if a major country tried to pressure me? You want me to hand over the culprit? Not a chance. Tisk, you're just as stubborn as I remember you to be. Well, if you were such a coward back then, you wouldn't have fought against the entire Barty Empire by yourself. That way, back then, Evelyn, Cher wouldn't have fallen for you. Evelyn lowered her voice to a whisper, but I still heard her clearly. However, I prefer to pretend that I didn't hear anything. After all, I really didn't want to know anything about the past. Aren't you curious? Of course I'm a little curious. But considering how troublesome it will be if I remember, I think it's better not to know. Or, is there something that I need to remember? I smiled as I spoke. However, Evelyn suddenly gritted her teeth. You're smiling even more slyly than I remember, you liar. All right then, it was me who didn't know whether to laugh or cry. I seem to have accidentally stepped on a landmine. Fortunately, we were currently representing two major factions in negotiations, especially since Cher was watching from the sidelines. I temporarily forgot about my personal matters. When we were about done talking, Evelyn got up to leave, but she pulled Cher away with her, saying that she wanted to talk all night long to deepen the relationship between mother and daughter. However, I felt that Evelyn intended to tell Cher about the messy things from back in the day. Considering that I would need Evelyn's cooperation in order to cure Cher, rather than spending so much effort to gain her trust, it would be better to have Evelyn tell her directly. Of course, I didn't stop her. Sigh, this relationship is really messy. Forget it. Let's just let nature take its course. You're running away. What you said makes too much sense. I don't know how to refute you. The more he thought about his private affairs, the more confused he became. It was better for him to focus on proper business. Also, I really underestimated you. From a certain standpoint, Aso was truly an amazing individual. Let's not talk about his past achievements for now. We were no longer young people who liked to show off our achievements. So-called past glory was nothing more than a burden and annoyance to old people like us. Aso was the only one who had led the invasion by himself, and he had left behind several fatal chess pieces hidden in the shadows. No matter if it was the Bardi Empire's undead plague or the nuclear bomb that was constantly aimed at the True Symposium, they were all fatal trump cards. At the very least, if I were in his position, I wouldn't be as confident as he said I was. Perhaps the only thing he was lacking in was luck. In the game's history, Aso had indeed successfully led the invasion. However, it was because two thieves had reached into the same pocket and encountered the revived Titan Giants. In the end, Aso could only fight to the death against the Titan Giants. Some time ago, when Aso discovered that his scheme had been exposed and that the dimensional doors that he had just opened were likely to be closed, the entire return to the Tark Republic was in danger. Aso unhesitatingly sacrificed himself to ensure that the Tark Republic's return to the Tark Republic was set in stone. But on the other hand, Aso was far too important to the Tark Republic, as he was the person in charge of the entire game. As an undead emperor, Aso lacked trust in all of his comrades and subordinates. The result was that after Aso died, the secret that only he knew was lost, and those fatal traps weren't triggered. However, Aso was obviously unwilling to die just like that and bring everything to his grave. He had spent over 100 years working on this scheme before it even began. And so, Aso gave this key to the other undead emperor present at the time. However, he didn't tell Aso everything. After all, Aso didn't trust Roland at the time. In fact, he even hated Roland. However, a nuclear bomb that had lost its activation password was nothing more than trash. As long as the nuclear bomb's activation password existed, it would forever be a threat. So, as long as Aso threw out the key, he wouldn't suffer any losses. Now that he had the key to the door, it was naturally possible to find the only correct key in a bunch of keys. This is a potion made from 13 common medicinal ingredients. Only a small amount of this potion needs to be evaporated into the air to cause a mutation in the Bardi people's bloodline. And once this mutation occurs, it's impossible to reverse. Even though this was clearly an important item, Aso didn't seal it away in his memory along with all the other secrets. He had mixed this potion's formula with other alchemy knowledge and named it Aso's gift. However, the explanation below, it was rather vague, like increases the effectiveness of special undead magic. At this moment, I couldn't help but feel grateful that I had been quite busy recently, and I had zero interest in alchemy or potioneering. If I really had been foolish enough to casually make a potion to test its effects, perhaps I would have been able to challenge the top 10 on the calamity rankings. However, for ordinary mages, new knowledge and secrets were the ultimate goal of their lives. If any other alchemist received Asso's unique formula that he was so proud of, they would definitely immediately try to make it. That would be quite the joke. Asso was quite generous. Apart from this small gift, all of Asso's other gifts were accumulated over many years. However, an undead emperor was still an undead emperor. If anyone was deceived by his generous gifts and other gifts and thought that the entire treasury was safe, then this small gift would teach them a new understanding of what an undead calamity truly was. Evelyn had arrived rather briskly, but she left with great caution. After all, if even a tiny bit of the potion in her hands was leaked, it would be quite troublesome. Of course, I wouldn't be so insane as to play with an undead calamity. However, the greatest use of nuclear weapons was to intimidate, not to kill. As long as your enemies knew that you indeed had a large-scale weapon of mass destruction and that you were insane to use it, that would be enough. Since I had Yonye's reputation as a guarantor of the latter, nobody would suspect that I had the courage to use it. Perhaps many people would even think that I was a madman who was even more dangerous than Asso. As for the former, seeing was believing. I had just created a small potion of a weaker version of the potion. Evelyn had taken the potion. There were roughly 3 or 4 drops in it. If she used it in a sealed room, it would be no problem for her to create 100 or so undead calamities. As for whether the Bardi royalty would casually throw it away or use it on criminals on the death row, that was none of my business. No matter how the Bardi royalty had originally planned on dealing with this potion, it was no longer important. As long as the experimental results were out, as long as Orlas's brain wasn't damaged, he would know what to do. I could finally heave a sigh of relief now that I had a good hand. When I exited the cockpit, I discovered that the Dark Elves were still kneeling in the cockpit. Diana had a sincere and resolute expression, as if she was prepared to face any consequences. Yon's expression was filled with regret, and there were even traces of tears in her eyes. Meanwhile, Victoria had a bitter expression as she sat there. Her legs had long since gone numb. If it wasn't for her older sister's supervision, she would have long since escaped. Actually, she was indeed wronged. She had only been helping out and hadn't even done anything during the entire process. Yet, she had been dragged into this mess. If I recalled correctly, she was the one with the lowest luck stat. I nodded at this situation. At the very least, some of them were quite sincere in admitting their mistakes. This lesson should be effective. Get up. I've already taken care of the situation. There shouldn't be any problems. From a certain standpoint, this is also my fault. In the future, the Judgment Knight's work manual will need to be revised as well. At the very least, it's forbidden to immediately use a crime detection strike in a non-law enforcement zone. Diana and Yon didn't get up. They simply sat there quietly. However, it was Victoria who managed to crawl away for her life. Yep, her legs were now completely numb. No, this isn't my lord's fault. I was too rash. Yon was quite vexed as she emotionally blamed herself. I shook my head and didn't say anything else. It would be good for her to regret a little more. At the very least, this tomboy would be more careful and think things through in the future. But now that everyone else was busy with their own matters, there should have been only a few Dark Elves kneeling in the cockpit. But now, there was a rather familiar little girl in the cockpit. She was the half-elf that the Dark Elf had risked his life to protect during the day. Although she was still wrapped in bandages, she was currently teary-eyed as she looked at the 2 Dark Elves who were still kneeling in the cockpit. When she noticed me, she looked at me with an unfriendly expression. I became rather curious as I watched her half-round ears tremble. Just as I pointed a finger at her, "All right, at least explain to me what's going on. Also, introduce this naughty child to me, and then take her down." I could only helplessly raise my hand and point at the half-elf who refused to let go of me, no matter what. She was still muttering damned humans. I once again confirmed that there was nothing for me to discuss with naughty children. Next time, I wouldn't casually reach out to a rare beast that hadn't been tamed yet. It seemed like something was wrong here. Forget it, Let's not look into it. Rhea, hurry up and let go. When an naughty child finally let go, I felt a heartache as I rubbed the bite marks on my hand. However, I soon understood what had happened from their descriptions. The Grey Guardian? This is the first time I've heard of such a thing. After all, this is the humiliation of Rose and Dark Elf society. Not only that, they've always done their best to hide themselves. If it wasn't for the fact that Beck insisted on staying in Rhea's mother's home, such a thing wouldn't have happened. Now that something has happened, he'll probably change his mind. Dark Elf society wasn't a paradise. Not every Dark Elf would be able to accept such a cruel and heartless society. There would always be many defectors every year. Apart from the Grey Elves who were protected by the Moonlight Goddess, the Grey Guardian was also an organization created by a portion of the defectors. Unlike the Grey Elves who swore to fight against Rose to the end, these defectors only wanted to find a place to live out their days. However, since they hadn't undergone the Moonlight Ritual, their physical bodies were no different from ordinary Dark Elves. It would be difficult for them to survive on the surface. On a different level, they had the typical Dark Elf mentality and didn't trust their gray-skinned comrades. They felt that even if the gray-skinned comrades didn't have any shady schemes, they would still view themselves as cannon fodder in battle. And so, with the assistance of some Grey Elves and the Moonlight Goddess, some of the successful defectors took the lead and created this Grey Guardian organization that focused on self-help. The members of the Grey Guardian organization would usually live in a remote village and become mud-covered farmers. However, they would also receive help from the Moonlight Goddess's church. As for Beck, he was the injured Dark Elf. He had originally lived in a remote mountain area in Barty, and he had successfully married and had children. However, 10 years ago, his wife had passed away due to an illness, leaving behind a pair of half-elf daughters. It was precisely because his daughters wanted to visit the hometown that their mother always missed, which was why they had taken the risk to come to the capital. The result was today's incident. If it wasn't for the fact that Beck had sent out a distress signal in time, and Diana, who was originally a member of the Moonlight Goddess's church, had received the message, it was likely that Beck and his daughters would have already been burned at the stake. While I was still thinking about this, Beck, who was covered in injuries, struggled to walk out. The moment he arrived in front of me, he knelt on the ground. "I beg of you, my lord, please hurry and save my eldest daughter." Chapter 383. When Dark Elf Beck asked me for help, I was quite calm. After all, it seemed that we were the only ones who could help him right now. In fact, I was even a little excited. I've finally met a proper storyline. I, Roland, actually have a day where I can save a damsel in distress and defeat a slave trader. Could it be that the world is finally going to change? I'm finally going to walk on my path of greatness? If my guess was correct, and this family's eldest daughter had been kidnapped by a certain elf slave trader, then from a certain standpoint, this would be a very cliché fantasy storyline. Later on, I would just have to fight the slave trader and the mastermind behind the scenes. Perhaps I would even be able to obtain a few servants who were completely loyal to me. This storyline would be quite boring, but it would also be a rather proper development. No, this obviously isn't the right storyline. We should think more about it. If she was deeply in love with a certain man and decided to abandon her family and species in order to pursue her own love, then this would probably be a Korean or Japanese drama. And if she caught the eye of a certain domineering prince or CEO, then this would probably be a female-oriented storyline. If there was a sequel about a royal power struggle, then it would probably be one of the most popular harem dramas in the past 2 years. But it seemed that the storyline was even more wrong. My eldest daughter's name is Yolanda, and she's already 67 years old. All right then, a 67-year-old eldest daughter? It seemed that it was a bit too much for her to have a harem fight at such an age. Could it be that she got too high from dancing in the plaza and was arrested by the town security? Actually, I heard that there were also harem fights and grudges, as well as love killings and love triangles. Cough, cough. I should listen to the story more seriously. Reality would always be more bizarre than stories. This was because there was no need for logic in reality. There were so many weirdos in the world, and using a normal person's logic to guess the actions of weirdos was basically asking for trouble. Even without meeting her, I was certain that this half-elf named Yolanda was definitely a weirdo. You're saying that she's a half-elf with a market value of over 10,000 gold coins, and she ran off to join a certain prince in pursuit of wealth? Doesn't she know that her dark elf bloodline will cause suspicion? Perhaps she'll directly be sold to a slave trader. Slave trading in this country isn't illegal, and dark elf slaves are forever top-selling goods with an average price of over 60,000 gold coins. There's no market for them. The moment I said this, all the dark elves present looked at me in astonishment. The half-elf girl even took a step back and looked at me with a dangerous expression. All right then, it would seem that I accidentally exposed something. Fine. I admit that I was indeed tempted to buy a dark elf to corrupt myself. It wasn't that I had any special expectations, but rather that my maids weren't by my side right now, which made me feel rather empty. It was quite displeasing to have to do everything by myself. Not only that, I didn't have any servants to help me, but I also didn't have any. I didn't need to be so much. I didn't need to feel so empty so that I had to do everything by myself. What's wrong with heroes and legends? Heroes don't have to wash the dishes after eating, and legends don't have to sharpen their knives and mend their clothes. I really miss the corrupt life in the past. At least I don't have to worry every day about whether to eat black bread dipped in milk or to drink milk with pieces of black bread. I couldn't help it. How could I possibly have a sumptuous meal prepared whenever I was outside? Bread and milk were the staple foods of the entire world, yet I didn't like either of them, which made me feel even worse. Yep, I admit that I wasn't a staunch revolutionary. I had already been corrupted by the sugar-coated bullets of feudal society, who said that I had a maid complex. I had a maid complex. So what? I was a feudal landlord, and I was proud to have a maid complex. At the very least, I would pay her wages. As for why I was considering elves, wasn't it because humans were too weak and had too short a lifespan? An elf could be used for several hundred years. Cough, that wasn't the only use, so don't get the wrong idea. What? The silly cat could do it. I had to prepare milk and eggs for her every day, and if I forgot, she would go around telling everyone that I was a cat abuser. I was even starting to wonder who the real owner was. But when considering my personal image, especially since the town security elves were treating me like a saint more and more, even if I coincidentally met a country where slave trading was legal, this little hobby of mine had never been realized. I had originally thought that I would be able to openly obtain an elven maid by cracking down on slave traders. But now that I heard that the plot was so strange, I was naturally quite disappointed. Of course, Beck didn't know about these changes. He was only feeling conflicted about his strange daughter. Yolanda felt that she could hide her identity. To summarize, she was addicted to night novels, so she disguised her identity and joined a certain prince's assassin squadron. If it wasn't for the fact that she failed the maid test, would she have become a maid? Dark Elf Beck felt rather helpless when talking about his disappointing eldest daughter. There were many things that he couldn't say out loud. For example, his eldest daughter had been quite normal in the mountains, but she became a cripple who was addicted to night novels after coming to this city. She didn't go to work or go out every day, and only stayed at home thinking that some tyrannical prince would take a liking to her. Recently, she finally left home, but it was to chase after her true love. In fact, when Beck tried to stop her from leaving, she said, probably because she had seen far too many stories of people pretending to be in love with each other being exposed. Are you worried that you'll be exposed? That won't happen. I'm the true daughter of destiny. Just like in the stories, all dangers will transform into opportunities. When I'm exposed, I should be able to meet my beloved prince. Sigh. Can't my daughter be a little more normal? Sigh. I really wish I had a maid. The two men sighed at the same time, but the content of their sighs was quite different. However, the troubles in their sighs faintly resonated with each other, causing me to have a better impression of Beck. As for me, although I didn't understand why Beck's expression was so complex, I could more or less understand his helplessness and worry. After all, any family would encounter naughty children, and the current situation was indeed quite dangerous. No wonder Beck was begging me to save Yolanda. By now, Everyone knew that Prince Mills had been assassinated by a dark elf. It was only natural that the entire city would be on the lookout. And if Yolanda was discovered to be a dark elf, she would be killed. And if Yolanda discovered that her father and younger sister were actually involved in the assassination, it would be quite easy for her to do something. And if her identity was exposed, it would be the end of the world. This is her contact address. I'm afraid that we won't be able to enter the city right now. Please give her a message. No, please bring her out, no matter if she's willing or not. This city will become even more dangerous in the future, especially for elves like us. This was quite a small matter, so how could I possibly refuse? As expected of the romantic elves. Perhaps you'll have a half-elf granddaughter in the future. Seeing how awkward the atmosphere was, I casually joked as I accepted Beck's contact address. Old Beck could only smile wryly and didn't say anything. However, little Rhea, who had been biting my hand and wouldn't let go, suddenly spoke up. That's impossible. Us sisters would never have a human as a husband. I chuckled upon hearing this. Little girl, don't hate humans because of this. There are good humans and bad humans. There are evil bastards who want to kill you. But aren't there also people who want to save you? At the very least, I'm a human as well, probably. If this little girl had nodded innocently or directly retorted that humans are all bad, it would probably have been a normal scenario. But are you an idiot? What does this have to do with humans being good or bad? Rhea rolled her eyes and looked at me as if I was an idiot, just like how Harlowy sometimes looked at me. Only now did I recall that half-elves were a famous species of fake lowly. Their physical bodies grew at a speed comparable to elves, but their souls were only slightly slower than humans. A half-elf who looked like a young girl should already have the knowledge and personality of an adult. Perhaps that older sister who was poisoned by night novels also didn't look like an adult. Ordinary humans have such short lifespans, while we have such long lifespans. This was destined to be a tragic relationship from the very start. How could I be so foolish as to touch it? Rhea was angrily glaring at her father as she said this. Ever since Mom's wrinkled face interacted with Dad, I felt that this might not be the correct choice. From the day that Mom abandoned us 10 years ago, I swore that I would never find a human as my future partner. Only that mischievous older sister of mine would be so foolish and naive. When she returns, I'll properly teach her a lesson. Beck's father had an expression of helplessness and guilt when faced with his younger daughter's anger. In his opinion, it was enough for him to spend a lifetime with the person he loved. But for his daughters, watching their mother die of old age was a great deal of trouble. However, I suddenly thought of another problem. Then why did you bite me when you actually have the thought process of an adult? I hate people who treat me like a child the most, especially someone like you who's obviously an idiot. Idiot? Me? I'm already 60 years old, and I'm about to become a master alchemist and enchanter gold. I know 12 languages, and if it wasn't for my special circumstances, I would have long since obtained the title of scholar. You're at most 20 years old. Didn't you obtain a high status because of your birth? What else do you know? If you're not an ignorant idiot, then what are you? From a certain standpoint, half-elves were indeed a species favored by the heavens. Their growth rate was comparable to that of humans. Plus, elves had a reduced lifespan. As long as they weren't too lazy, they would sooner or later reach the peak in a certain area. However, perhaps it was precisely because of their natural talents that surpassed the two species from which they came from that they weren't welcomed by the two species. Since their bodies weren't fully developed yet, it was only natural that they would be unable to achieve anything in their combat job class. If they wanted to learn magic, there was no way for them to do so. Indeed, it would be more suitable for them to work hard in the field of knowledge. However, the fact that she was able to become a master alchemist proved that her natural talent and hard work were both excellent. This was the first time that someone had ever accused me of being ignorant and incompetent. I was immediately angered and amused, but then I thought of some other trivial matters. If this Rhea really had the intelligence of an adult, why would she be so foolish as to offend me in my territory? She was only trying to show off her own value and make us pay more attention to her. A master alchemist who was about to break through to the gold rank would be quite valuable, while a master alchemist who didn't have the ability to protect herself would only be a precious treasure. Perhaps she also saw the current situation and thought of the possibility that she would be treated as a murderer and handed over to the authorities. Being exploited for her value was better than being burned at a stake. Otherwise, she wouldn't have risked her life to reveal her value. Considering things this way, her intelligence and actions far surpassed her immature outer appearance. Harloise seems to be the same type of person as you. She seems pure, but is actually a black-bellied fake lowly. Why can't I meet someone who's a little more foolish, cute, and normal? TSK, she's far inferior to me. However, she's indeed a good seedling. I intend to do a few small tests. If it's possible, perhaps you'll have a junior sister. Forget it, I have plenty of juniors and juniors. Only a few of them are still alive. If you're acting like a teacher again, you can play with little girls by yourself. I tossed the silly cat, who was rolling and screaming in midair, to Rhea and said, "Little girl, don't overthink things. The Bardi Empire doesn't have the ability to make me hand over anyone. By the way, I'm already more than 300 gold coins, while the silly cat in your hands is at least 10,000 gold coins." I didn't even look at the astonished Rhea as I went about my own business. Since I had already reached a preliminary agreement with the Bardi royalty, there was naturally no need to hide in a cramped assault airship. While I had them make some adjustments, it was also time for me to check on the situation of the people who had stayed behind in the Bardi Empire's residence. The people who stayed behind in the Bardi Empire's residence were all true diplomats from the Mage country. Envoys wouldn't be killed in a battle between two countries, so they stayed behind to test Bardi's attitude. The moment that I left the residence, someone chased after me. "Grim, Galena? I want to go out for a walk as well." I met with such a situation as soon as I arrived. I haven't even had the chance to tour around the Bardi Empire yet. Compared to the past, even though I still wore an eye patch for my evil eyes, my complexion was much better. Even though I still looked young, the way I dressed made me look more feminine and cute. This wasn't just the effect of my blood transfusion to suppress my magic veins. It was also the tacit understanding between Carwins and me. Two descendants, one on each side. Whoever's disciple is more accomplished will be the strongest. That was probably what Cavendish was thinking, ignoring whether or not my Chinibu way of thinking was correct. At the very least, Galena was able to sleep peacefully every night without her bloodline calling out to her. At the very least, her personality had matured quite a bit. As I watched her skillfully jump into the Grim-style armor, her fingers nimbly clicking on all the switches as she excitedly activated the armor, I immediately decided to take back what I had just said. "Boss, the current Grim is more than 5 times more powerful than before. There's also a storage space for gunpowder, so its combat strength is at least 3 times more powerful than before. Give the order. Let's go all out." A deep male voice came from the armor as numerous lights lit up. All sorts of explosives and cannons were taken out and adjusted. The machine gun under Galena's arm automatically reloaded. As I listened to the young man's excited voice, I once again confirmed the rumor about Queen Sluir. Queen Galena had 2 personalities. As long as she put on the armor, her personality would automatically switch. I shook my head and stopped thinking too much about it. I wasn't a Chinibu like Cavendish, nor was I a pedophile like Harloise. I would rather let nature take its course as to what Galena would become. But now I could more or less understand why she automatically followed me. She probably didn't know that we were still negotiating with the Bardi Empire. Seeing that I had come out, she probably thought that there would be a chance to fight, so she directly followed me. Still, I had no intentions of refusing. This was a perfect opportunity to learn more about the changes in my home. Although I had plenty of information, how could it compare to the personal feelings of the people involved? As I expected, Galena was quite depressed when she discovered that there was no battle to fight. I need a chance to test my new weapon in actual combat. However, she became much more serious when talking about the situation in the Northlands. After all, she had already been the queen for almost a year. Unlike Renee, who had many helpers, Galena could mostly only rely on herself. As long as our new crops have a good harvest, this year's situation won't be too bad, no matter how bad it is. Also, the barbarians' holy mountain seems to have discovered a new mithril mine. It's just that the old barbarians are still arguing against mining it. But I feel like it's only a matter of time before they agree with your Merchant Alliance's silver bullets. Of course, I'm guessing that you want to know the most about the Northland's public opinion and the morale of the people. I can only say that it's much better than expected. Morale is quite high, and the people's hearts can be used. Galena endlessly talked about official matters while her small hand were playing with various firearms and explosives, disassembling, assembling, and adjusting them. She was multitasking and didn't make a single mistake. While I sighed at how strange this girl's personality was becoming, I was actually quite happy. After all, the Northlands had now become our base of operations. If everything went smoothly there, that would be the best news. From a certain standpoint, Galena was far more normal than her cousin Renee. At the very least, compared to Princess Renee, who was becoming more and more known as the active seal, Queen Galena's reputation for being an expert in government affairs and wise was becoming more and more widespread. As a genius engineer, Galena had an incredibly deep understanding of magical engineering to begin with. In fact, she was already using magical engineering products to change the lives of the Sluir Kingdom citizens. Not to mention, she was also quite talented in military and political affairs. Perhaps Cavendish's way of thinking was correct. Compared to Renee, who was becoming more and more brute force, Galena was the most suitable successor for me, who had a lot of knowledge in miscellaneous fields. Of course, this wasn't because I was intending to retire from the front lines at such a young age. It was because it was necessary to have a backup plan. Nobody could guarantee that I wouldn't suddenly be killed by a true god on the streets or meet with an assassin. I suddenly feel like I'm a jinx. Haha, I think we're quite lucky. It's about time to show them our new equipment. We were only one street away from our temporary base. However, there were suddenly very few people on the street. The intentionally concealed breathing and shadows in the darkness revealed the identity of the newcomers, assassins. Hey, Galena, remember to leave 2 people alive for interrogation. Chapter 384. 2 under the tree. I casually told them their locations. Following the explosion of flames, I discovered that Grimm's mecha's machine gun was in the shape of a gun. Fine then, if I use caliber and power to define the difference between a gun and a cannon, then this was a machine gun. The golden-coated machine gun spun furiously, and the muzzle spat out bright red flames. Every shot naturally exploded, followed by endless explosions and screams of pain. When a machine gun's barrel overheated and was forced to stop, the mecha instantly released a large amount of steam. All that was left of the towering tree was a tree stump and splintered wood. As for the unlucky bastard hiding inside, he had probably turned into a hornet's nest. If I looked carefully, I might be able to piece him back together. 2 on the ground. This time, I casually stomped on the ground, and the entire brick floor would be as hard as an Arctic glacier. No matter how they entered, I could only hope that they would be able to find a way out before they suffocated. Noticing that we had discovered the assassins, there was a sharp shout, and countless black-clothed individuals jumped out from rooftops, corners, trash cans, sewers, and all sorts of other unusual places. Just as I was about to draw my sword, I saw Grimm's mecha's entire body flash with light, and all of its joints were smoking, so I rationally took a step back. Fire all bullets. The next instant, small holes opened up on the mecha's knees, chest, and shoulders. Fire-colored bullets shot out, creating beautiful fireworks and fatal explosions. Countless meteors streaked through the sky, lighting up the entire night sky. What followed was endless screams and howls of pain. Now that Grimm's mecha no longer needed to disguise itself as a normal male, Galena unhesitatingly modified and evolved her mecha. Or perhaps it should be said that she dismantled and reassembled it. Perhaps it was because she had heard a certain person's nonsense about having more cannon turrets is justice. Or perhaps it was her nature to worship the results of explosions. It was said that the new Grimm mecha had over 100 cannons on its body. Fine then, apart from its basic walking function, it was basically a mobile cannon turret. The key difference between the new Grimm mecha and the previous one was that the new Grimm mecha was a product of magical engineering. The breakthrough of a key technological bottleneck often led to the advancement of the entire industry. This was a process that could be used in any world. In the past, the guns and cannons of this world were still the upgraded and improved versions of the traditional dwarven guns. No matter how much the parts were upgraded, the theory was still the same as the dwarves. Dwarven gunpowder would be used to create a small explosion in the gun's chamber, and the propelling force would be used to shoot out tiny copper pellets that would then kill and injure the opponent. In principle, this seemed to be similar to the most primitive flintlock on Earth. However, due to the progress in the smelting of magical metals and the advantage of alchemy in the distribution of explosives, a well-made dwarven flintlock was already quite powerful. It was enough to pose a threat to a silver-ranked combatant. However, it lacked the threat to a top-tier warrior. That was its weakness. Of course, the intelligence of the otherworld people was not to be underestimated. Their technology was not enough to increase the lethality of the dwarven firearms, so they adopted the primitive method of expanding the size of the dwarven firearms. The enlarged dwarven cannons, siege cannons, giant goblin cannons, and titan cannons were all very deadly. The power of a single gun wouldn't be enough to kill you, but the goblin cannons with a combined power of 100 guns would definitely be enough. However, the increase in size and mass also made these guns and cannons abnormally difficult to use. They were difficult to move and could only be used for sieging, defending, and warship battles. Their most fatal flaw was the lack of accuracy caused by their slow movement, coupled with the fact that dwarven and goblin products had always been unreliable. These cannons could only become immobile siege weapons. Even among siege equipment, due to the competition from ballistae, ancient relics, and mage towers, these cannons couldn't be considered outstanding. That was why, although cannons had long since appeared in this cold weapon battlefield where flying troops and elite individual soldiers existed, cannons had always been limited to low-end battles, where they killed a large number of ordinary soldiers. In fact, some military experts even treated cannons as useless in actual combat. After all, elite squadrons and top-level individuals would often be able to easily crush ordinary warriors. Even if they killed all ordinary soldiers, they wouldn't be able to obtain any substantial combat results. And after Olivia's magic box and the 4 elemental swordcasters who wielded magic swords were introduced, a new job class was born. However, this job class didn't receive much attention, the magic bullet shooter class. The magic guns they wielded were actually created from the same system as Olivia's magic sword. This meant that the magic guns they wielded were fundamentally different from the dwarven firearms. Their magic guns and magic bullets were magically powered. They were creations that could be strengthened with the magic and engineering of this world. Not powerful enough? Have a taste of my fire magic bullets. They even had explosive and cluster effects. Not fast enough? Wind magic bullets flew faster than birds, and they even had an acceleration effect. If you still felt that they weren't fast enough, here were also lightning magic bullets. Just that, you had to be prepared to defend against lightning before using them. Super defensive targets? Have a taste of my earth magic armor-piercing bullets. These bullets are as hard as diamonds. Do you need to obstruct the target and assist them? Have a taste of my mist magic bullets. I also have ice magic bullets that can freeze the ground and spiderweb magic bullets that can stick to enemies. The job classes created by Olivia's magic box were all job classes that relied on external items. While the 4 elemental swordcasters were focused on researching sword seals and magic swords, the magic bullet shooters were also competing with their own magic guns and magic bullets. Wind magic gun barrels that increased the speed of bullets, gun muzzles that increased the armor-piercing effect of bullets, scopes that came with the Eagle's Eye spell, and many other accessories were invented. While magic energy consumption skyrocketed, these accessories also made the magic bullet shooters even more powerful. These basic improvements were only the beginning. Along with the improvements in weapons, there were also all sorts of specialized combat techniques. The wind magic bullet shooters had not only incredibly long-range magic sniper guns, but they also had techniques that allowed magic bullets to freely fly through the air like snakes. Meanwhile, The top-level fire magic bullet shooters focused their attention on firepower and power. Yep, Galena was one of them. Last year, when Renee was still hesitantly trying to become a 4-elemental swordcaster, the young queen of Intune also immediately came into contact with Olivia's magic box and unhesitatingly became a magic bullet shooter. However, unlike Renee, who was always slacking off, Galena, who was capable of inventing the grim mecha armor in the underground and was skilled at creating all sorts of explosives, was definitely a top-level genius mechanic. When Galena acutely noticed the dawn of a new generation, she unhesitatingly threw herself into it. Unlike Timlad, who focused on creating things in theory, the eternally insecure Galena focused on actual combat. She focused on inventing all sorts of practical firearms, such as this revolving cannon. If this cannon was powered by traditional gunpowder, it would require reloading every time it exploded. Continuous explosions would basically be suicidal. But if it was powered by wind and fire magic, as long as the mechanics were up to par, it would be easy to fire in rapid succession. Not to mention, it was possible to use magic to strengthen the gun's body and increase the explosive power. But this was only the beginning. The entire Grim Mecha armor was actually Galena's Olivia magic gun. The bullets it fired were filled with fire magic. Galena's demon bloodline was naturally inclined towards fire, so she had plenty of fire magic. For example, since I had the abilities of a mage, my path as a 4-elemental swordcaster was quite smooth. She had natural talent as a mage to begin with, and her current abilities were the future direction of magical archers. She had already gone quite far on this path. Asterisk boom. Asterisk after an explosive fireball was fired, the entire house was reduced to rubble. Rubble flew everywhere, and a small mushroom cloud rose up into the sky. The special part about this bullet wasn't the gun itself. Instead, it was the bullet that was tossed out. That bullet was an Olivia's magic box equipped with sufficient explosive magic arrays and explosives. When all of the magic power in the box was activated in one go, all of the magic power would transform into a primer for self-destruction. This attack would be no different from a low-level mage's self-destruction magic attack in terms of principle and power. And so, mushroom clouds slowly rose into the sky. The ground constantly trembled as the entire street was reduced to rubble. Of course, there was no need to recycle the Olivia's magic box that had been used in such a manner. Considering how expensive it was, the Northlands dared to do such a thing, mainly because the only magic bullet shooter who had enough money to afford such ammunition was the queen herself. She said that the new magic bullet shooters and 4-elemental swordcasters were just for show. That was probably because she had never seen a player who was willing to spend so much money. You're rich and willful. I'll smash you to death with gold. This was probably the foundational reason why Galena had been able to go so far as a money-burning magic bullet shooter. But, at the very least, the power of money was quite obvious when it came to magical engineering. Her fireball was astonishingly powerful. Even a gold-ranked battle job class would be seriously injured if they didn't die. The grim mecha that was capable of continuously firing such powerful attacks was comparable to a legend-ranked mecha. I didn't even need to do anything. I watched as Galena single-handedly suppressed all her opponents. The entire sky was filled with her cannon fire. She suspected that there were assassins hiding, and with a single blast, the assassins were sent flying along with their bunkers. Damn it, it's overheating again. The next instant, Galena jumped out of her comfortable mecha. Judging from the black smoke rising from the cockpit, it was evident that this new mecha was still unable to fire the so-called full fireball. A berserk magical circuit would eventually burn down the mecha's magical components, which were still quite primitive. This grim mecha still needed to be perfected. I shook my head. The magic bullet shooter job class still needed to be perfected. While the grim mecha's firepower was too strong, it also lacked stability and endurance. This would also require more money to be perfected. While Galena was busy cooling down her mecha, I immediately unsheathed my sword. Although it seemed like the assassin had been blasted into the sky, My instincts told me that there was danger lurking in the shadows. The truly troublesome assassin had yet to appear. Who could it be? It wouldn't be a good idea to assassinate me at a time like this. If I, the Bardi Empire's ambassador, died as well, a war between the two countries would be unavoidable. In that case, just who could it be? The remaining Mills faction that was unwilling to die, just like this? The prince who wanted to take revenge for his brother and fight for fame? The dragons who were dissatisfied with me? The emperor who was angry from embarrassment? Although I went overboard and even threatened the undead calamity if I died, I felt that this threat was still meaningful to the Bardi royalty. The emperor will probably restrain these factions. In that case, there's only one option left for the undead to stay in the Bardi capital and not be controlled by the emperor. Undead, Dark Knight, Undead Knight, high-level Lich, Skeleton General, Death Naga, Demon of Corruption, and various other high-level undead walked out of the shadows. That's right, the undead army that appeared before me was the final army left behind by Osso. Even if Osso's death caused the various factions in the Bardi capital to change their attitude towards the undead, making them go from being worshipped by everyone to being hated by everyone, these high-level undead have been operating here for several decades. Osso and his subordinates were definitely sly and cunning. How could they possibly be so easily uprooted? Some of the undead remained hidden in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to viciously attack the living. And at such a critical time, if I died here, the relationship between the two countries would rapidly worsen. It might even lead to a war. In that case, the victor would naturally be the Tark Republic, a third party. There weren't many undead, no more than 20 in total. However, their quality was surprisingly high. At first glance, even the weakest undead seemed to be at the gold rank. There were quite a few legends and saints, and there were even 3 epic rank undead lords. Oh my, this is what it means to reveal the dagger.